Echoes of Machiavelli, the journalist who found Tupac. The email arrived at 3 a.m. Ava Ramirez had been awake anyway, scrolling through decades-old forum posts about unsolved mysteries in hip-hop history, when her phone lit up with a notification that made her heart skip. The glow from the screen cast blue shadows across her cramped studio apartment in Los Angeles, illuminating the wall where she had pinned articles about cold cases and industry cover-ups. Empty coffee cups littered her desk. The city outside her window was silent, except for the occasional wail of a siren cutting through the darkness. The subject line was blank. This sender was a scrambled string of characters that looked like it had been generated by a random algorithm. But the message itself was crystal clear. Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. She read it 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. September 7th. Everyone who knew anything about hip-hop knew that date. September 7th, 1996. The night Tupac Shakur was shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. The night that changed music forever. The night that spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories and launched an entire subculture of people who believed the most famous rapper in the world had faked his own death. Ava had covered music industry scandals for 7 years, clawing her way up from unpaid blog post to a staff position at one of the most respected music journalism sites on the internet. She had exposed label corruption, uncovered ghostwriting schemes, and revealed the truth behind manufactured beefs designed to sell records. Her apartment walls were covered with printed articles bearing her byline, each one a small victory in a war against an industry that thrived on secrecy and spin. But this was different. This was the white whale. This was the story that could define a career or destroy it completely. She'd grown up listening to Tupac. Her older brother Marcus had been obsessed with him, playing All Eyes on Me until the CD was scratched beyond repair. When Marcus was killed in a drive-by shooting when Ava was 16, she had clung to Tupac's music like a lifeline, finding solace in the raw anger and vulnerability of someone who understood what it meant to live surrounded by violence. Investigating Tupac's death wasn't just professional ambition, it was personal in ways she had never admitted to anyone. She looked at the message again. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. What the hell did that mean? The first 2 phrases seemed obvious enough. 2 fates could refer to Tupac's alleged death versus his survival. 1 body could mean the body that was supposedly Tupac in the casket. But 1 jar? That made no sense. Was it metaphorical? Literal? Some kind of code? She screenshot the email and saved it to 3 different cloud services, then forwarded it to her encrypted backup account. If this was real, if someone actually had information about what happened to Tupac, she couldn't risk losing the only contact point. By sunrise, she had booked a flight to Las Vegas. By noon, she'd created a secure cloud folder and begun compiling everything she could find about that night in September 1996. And by midnight, she was convinced that someone out there knew something the rest of the world didn't. This wasn't a hoax. This was an invitation. The question was, an invitation to the truth, or an invitation to become another casualty in a cover-up that had lasted nearly 3 decades. Act 1. The Unsettled Record. The official story was simple enough. On September the 7th, 1996, Tupac Shakur attended a Mike Tyson boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. After the fight, he and Death Row Records CEO Marion Knight got into an altercation with a gang member in the casino lobby. Security footage showed the confrontation. Witnesses confirmed it happened. What came next was inevitable in the logic of gang violence and street justice. Later that night, Tupac and Knight were driving to a nightclub when a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their black BMW at a red light on Flamingo Road. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire. 4 bullets hit Tupac. 2 hit his chest, 1 his arm, 1 his thigh. Knight was grazed by shrapnel but otherwise unharmed. The Cadillac sped away into the night and was never found. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. He underwent multiple surgeries. His right lung was removed. For 6 days, he fought for his life in the intensive care unit while the world held its breath. Then, on September the 13th, 1996, at 4:03 in the afternoon, Tupac Amaru Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. The killer was never caught. The case went cold. The official investigation stalled, and the conspiracy theories began almost immediately. Ava sat in her hotel room in Las Vegas, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, glowing with forum threads and archived news articles. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the desert heat that pressed against the windows. She had been researching for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, living on coffee and takeout from the casino buffets downstairs. The carpet smelled like cigarette smoke that had seeped in from the hallway. The walls were thin enough that she could hear muffled conversations and slot machine jingles from the casino floor below. The more she dug, the more questions emerged, spreading out like cracks in a windshield after impact. Why was there no public autopsy photo? Why was the casket closed at the funeral? Why did Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, cremate his body immediately after a private ceremony that excluded most of the media? Why were so many details about his final days kept under seal by hospital privacy laws that seemed unusually strict even by medical standards? She had created a timeline on the wall using tape and printed documents, connecting events with red string like something out of a detective thriller. It looked obsessive because it was obsessive, but obsession was what separated good journalists from mediocre ones. You had to be willing to lose yourself in the story, to let it consume you until the truth revealed itself. She found a Reddit post from June 5th, 2024 that had caught her attention during her initial research. The user claimed to have been tracking the online conspiracy community for years and had noticed something strange. The Tupac is Alive sites went deep in the archive. Malaysia, Cuba, a Navajo reservation. I saw movement. Movement? What kind of movement? She had tried to contact the user directly but received no response. The account had gone dormant shortly after that post, which was either suspicious or simply the natural life cycle of someone who had moved on to other interests. She started following the breadcrumbs. There were websites dedicated to photographic analysis, comparing tattoos on a man photographed in Belize to Tupac's documented body art. The comparisons were surprisingly detailed, noting the placement of his thug life tattoo across his stomach, the theatrical masks on his shoulder, the cross with his mother's name Afeni on his back. There were audio experts claiming voice pattern matches on recordings allegedly made years after his death, citing pitch analysis and speech patterns that they insisted were identical. There were sightings reported from a dozen countries, each one detailed enough to sound plausible but vague enough to remain unverified. The persistence was what struck her. Nearly 3 decades after his death, people were still looking, still analysing, still believing. This wasn't just nostalgia or denial. This was something deeper, a cultural wound that refused to heal because it had never been properly examined in the first place. She decided to reach out to people who had actually known him, people whose credibility couldn't be easily dismissed. First, she contacted a former member of the Outlaws, Tupac's affiliated rap group. The man, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, told her something that stuck in her mind. They spoke on an encrypted video call at 2 a.m, the man's face partially shadowed to protect his identity. Behind him, Ava could see gold and platinum records hanging on the wall, relics from a different era. Pac was paranoid near the end, he said, his voice carrying the weight of old memories and older regrets. Not crazy paranoid, smart paranoid. He knew people wanted him dead. He talked about disappearing sometimes, just vanishing and starting over. We thought he was joking, you know. Pac was always talking big, always had some master plan he was working on. But looking back, maybe he was planning something. He asked me once what I would do if I had to start my life over with a new identity. I laughed it off. Now I wonder if he was testing the idea, seeing how people would react. Did he ever mention specific places he might go? Ava asked, leaning closer to her screen. The man shook his head. Not really, but he talked a lot about Africa, about going back to his roots. He mentioned Cuba a few times because of his stepfather's connections there, and he was fascinated by islands, isolated places where you could see people coming from miles away. He said cities made you vulnerable, too many angles of attack. Do you think he's alive? There was a long pause. The man looked away from the camera, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. I think Pac understood something most people don't, he finally said. Death is easy. It's living that's hard. If he wanted to disappear, if he wanted to become someone else, he had the resources and the intelligence to pull it off. Do I think he did it? I don't know, but I wouldn't bet against him. Pac always won in the end, even when it looked like he was losing. Next, she interviewed a music historian who specialised in 1990s hip-hop culture. The historian, a professor at UCLA named James Robertson, met her at a coffee shop near campus. He was in his 50s, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a vintage Public Enemy shirt, a man who had lived through the era he now taught about. His office, he had told her, was buried in boxes of vinyl records and archived interviews from the golden age of hip-hop. The Don Killuminati, the 7-day theory, Robertson explained, stirring sugar into his coffee with methodical precision, was released under the alias Machiavelli. That's a reference to Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher who wrote about political strategy and deception. One of Machiavelli's ideas was that faking one's death could be a useful tactic for escaping enemies and starting fresh. Tupac read extensively in prison. He knew this. He studied everything from Shakespeare to Sun Tzu, and he chose that exact alias for his posthumous album, which, by the way, was recorded in only 7 days. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. So you think the album title was intentional? Ava asked. That he was leaving a message? Robertson smiled. Tupac didn't do anything by accident. Every tattoo, every album cover, every lyric was carefully constructed to convey meaning. The man was a poet and a revolutionary, but he was also incredibly strategic. If you listen to the Machiavelli album, really listen to it, there are lines that feel like someone saying goodbye, but not the kind of goodbye you say when you're dying, the kind you say when you're leaving. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes. Listen to this. On the track titled Blasphemy, he says something about his enemies thinking they've won, but he'll be back when they least expect it. On another track he talks about watching from the shadows. These could just be tough guy posturing, sure, but they could also be someone telling you exactly what they're about to do, hiding the truth in plain sight where no one will believe it. Ava made notes, her hand cramping from writing so fast. The pieces were interesting, but they weren't proof. They were the kinds of details that fueled speculation but didn't constitute evidence. She needed something harder, something tangible, something that couldn't be dismissed as interpretation or wishful thinking. That's when she found the police memo. Aced 2, a secret going cold. The document was buried in a batch of declassified Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department records released under a Freedom of Information Act request, filed by a journalist back in 2015. Most of the files were routine incident reports and administrative paperwork, the bureaucratic debris of the police department handling thousands of cases. But one memo stood out. It was dated September 14th, 1996, the day after Tupac's death was announced. The memo was addressed to the department's media relations office and contained instructions for handling press inquiries about the case. One line jumped off the page, highlighted in yellow marker by whoever had previously reviewed these files. No body photographs to be released under any circumstances, no public casket footage authorised. Family has requested complete privacy during viewing and service. Comply immediately. Ava stared at the screen until her eyes burned. The wording was unusual. Police departments typically release some kind of confirmation in high-profile death cases, even if just procedural details. Death certificates, cause of death, basic autopsy findings. but this seemed designed to create a complete blackout of visual evidence. The phrase, "comply immediately," suggested urgency that went beyond normal family privacy requests. She decided to visit University Medical Center herself. The hospital was a sprawling complex in downtown Las Vegas, a fortress of concrete and glass that loomed over the surrounding neighborhood. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Ava crossed the parking lot, heat radiating up from the asphalt in shimmering waves. Inside, the air conditioning was almost aggressive, cold enough to make her shiver after the blast furnace of the parking lot. The place had that universal hospital smell, antiseptic and floor wax, and something underneath that was probably fear and grief mixed together. Ava walked through the main entrance, trying to look like she belonged there, her press credentials tucked into her bag just in case, a folder full of fake paperwork visible in her arms to make her seem official. She found the records department tucked away on the second floor, down a corridor that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them flickering intermittently. A security camera watched from the corner, its red light, blinking steadily. The door was marked "Medical Records, Authorized Personnel Only." She knocked and entered before anyone could tell her not to. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk buried in manila folders and outdated computer equipment. He was in his 40s, balding, with the exhausted expression of someone who spent their days dealing with bureaucratic requests from lawyers and insurance companies. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting immediately to professional wariness. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested he very much hoped he couldn't. Ava put on her most professional smile and submitted a formal request for patient exit logs from September 1996, specifically for Ward B, where critical care patients were housed. She had prepared a story about researching hospital procedures for a medical journalism piece, but she never got to use it. The clerk looked at her request and shook his head almost immediately, not even pretending to check any systems. "Privacy laws," he said flatly, pushing the paper back toward her. "Medical records from that time period are sealed, even patient logs. You'd need a court order or family authorization." "What if the patient is deceased?" Ava asked, knowing the answer but wanting to see his reaction. "Still sealed, hospital policy." He crossed his arms, making it clear the conversation was over. "Even after almost 30 years? Ma'am, those records could stay sealed for 50 years or more. It doesn't matter how long it's been. Without proper authorization, I can't help you." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "And between you and me, some records are sealed for reasons that go beyond normal privacy laws. If you're asking about who I think you're asking about, that file has been flagged since 1996. Federal seal. That means someone in Washington decided no one gets to see it without going through them first." Ava felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the office. "Federal seal? For what reason?" The clerk shrugged. "Above my pay grade. Could be witness protection, could be national security, could be a dozen other things. All I know is that file doesn't exist as far as this department is concerned." She thanked him and left, frustrated but not surprised. She had expected resistance. The question was whether that resistance was standard procedure or something more deliberate. The mention of a federal seal was interesting. What would trigger federal involvement in a gang-related shooting? That evening, back in her hotel room, she began researching the online presence of conspiracy theorists who claimed to have evidence of Tupac's survival. One name kept appearing in forum discussions: Michael A., a man living in Belize who posted occasional videos online with his face blurred out, claiming he had encountered someone matching Tupac's description in the small island town of San Pedro years ago. Most people dismissed him as a crank seeking attention. But Ava noticed something in his videos. The details were too specific to be complete fabrications. He described the tattoos accurately, including ones that weren't widely photographed, like the smaller designs on Tupac's hands and the exact placement of every element. He knew about Tupac's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the specific cadence of his speech, the habit of touching his chin when he was thinking. Either this man had done extensive research that went beyond what any normal fan would attempt, or he had actually met someone who knew these details intimately. Ava made a decision. She booked a flight to Belize, leaving the next morning. She arrived in early July, stepping off the plane into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The small airport in Belize City was a chaos of tourists, locals, taxi drivers shouting destinations, and the overwhelming smell of tropical vegetation and saltwater. She had created a cover story. She was a travel writer doing a piece on Central American island culture. She didn't want to attract attention by announcing she was investigating Tupac sightings. The ride to San Pedro took her on a small ferry that bounced across turquoise water so clear she could see fish swimming beneath the hull. The town itself was a collection of pastel-coloured buildings on stilts, sandy streets where golf carts outnumbered cars, and an atmosphere of deliberate disconnection from the rest of the world. This was the kind of place people came when they wanted to disappear. She spent 3 days making casual inquiries at local bars and restaurants, nursing beers and striking up conversations with bartenders and shopkeepers. Most people were friendly, but unhelpful, offering the practiced vagueness of islanders who had learned not to ask questions about the tourists and expats who drifted through. A few locals seemed uncomfortable when she mentioned seeing an American man with tattoos who had been in the area years ago. One bartender told her, "People come here to disappear. We don't ask questions. Bad for business." But on her 3rd day, she met an older woman named Rosa, who ran a small guest house on Caye Caulker, a nearby island even more remote than San Pedro. Rosa was in her 60s, weathered by sun and salt, with eyes that had seen enough of life to be cautious but curious. They sat on Rosa's porch overlooking the water, drinking strong coffee, while pelicans dove for fish in the shallows. When Ava mentioned she was researching American expats who had settled in Belize in the late 1990s, Rosa's eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember one man," Rosa said carefully, as if testing each word before releasing it. "This was a long time ago, maybe 20 years or more. He stayed here for a few weeks, never gave his real name, just called himself T, paid cash always, very particular about that. Kept to himself mostly, but he was polite, good tipper, but you could see he was watching everything, you know, like a man who expects trouble." "What did he look like?" Ava asked, trying to keep her voice casual while her heart hammered against her ribs. Rosa leaned back in her chair, eyes distant with memory. Tall, strong-built, dark skin, and tattooed. Oh my god, tattooed everywhere. His arms, his chest. I saw them when he was swimming. He went swimming at night usually, when the beach was empty, and his face, I knew I had seen it before, on TV maybe, or magazine, but I couldn't place it. My daughter, she was maybe 15 then, she said to me one day, "Mama, that man looks like that rapper, the one who got shot." And I told her, "No, Mia, that man is dead." But after she said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. "What happened to him?" Ava asked, leaning forward. Rosa shrugged, her expression darkening slightly. "He left one morning, early, before sunrise. I saw him go because I was up making breakfast. A boat came for him, not the regular ferry. Private boat, expensive looking. 3 men on it, all business. They didn't come to shore. He waded out to them with his bag held over his head. Then they were gone, heading south along the coast. I never saw him again. Do you remember anything else? Anything he said, or anything unusual about his stay?" Rosa thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "One thing, he had a jar with him. Glass jar, like for preserving food, but sealed with wax. He kept it wrapped in a towel in his room. I saw it once when I was cleaning. Inside the jar was something dark, like ashes or dirt. I asked him about it, and he said it was sacred. From home, that's all he would say. One jar." Ava felt electricity course through her. The cryptic message from the anonymous email suddenly made more sense. One jar wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. But what was in it? And why was it important enough to mention alongside the other clues? Back in her hotel room that night, she reviewed documents she had obtained through less official channels. A source in Las Vegas, a former emergency services dispatcher who had helped her for a previous story about EMT protocols, had sent her copies of ambulance run logs from September 7th, 1996. Most of the entries were routine: heart attacks, car accidents, drug overdoses. Each one had a patient number, a timestamp, a basic description of injuries, and a destination. But one entry stood out like a sore thumb. Patient 1724, transferred, VIP code 3, no name recorded, personal effects, one sealed glass container, contents unknown, VIP code 3. Ava researched what that meant and found that it was a designation used for high-profile patients requiring maximum security and privacy. Celebrities, politicians, witnesses in federal cases, the kind of people whose presence in a hospital could create chaos if it became public knowledge. But why no name? Every other entry in the log, even other VIP cases, had at least initials or a case number that could be cross-referenced with hospital admission records. This one was blank, and the personal effects line, one sealed glass container, just like Rosa had described, just like the anonymous email had hinted at. What was in that jar? And why had it travelled with Tupac from Las Vegas to Belize? She compared the timestamp. The ambulance run for patient 1724 occurred at 11:17 at night on September 7th. That matched the time frame of Tupac's shooting. But the transfer notation was what caught her attention. Transferred where? And why would that detail be omitted from an official record? Ava sat at her laptop deep into the night, the sound of waves crashing on the shore mixing with the whir of her computer fan. She was getting close to something. She could feel it the way you could feel a storm coming before the first drops of rain fell. The pattern was there. The evidence was mounting. But she still didn't have the whole picture. She needed to understand who had the means and motive to help Tupac disappear. She needed to follow the money. She needed to find out what was in that jar. Act 3. The grounds for fake death. Ava returned to Las Vegas with more questions than answers, but at least now they were the right questions. She needed to understand the context better, to map the ecosystem of power and money and violence that surrounded Tupac in the weeks before his death. Who had the means and motive to help him fake his death? Who stood to gain, and who stood to lose? She started with Marion Soog Knight. Knight was the CEO of Death Row Records, the label that had made Tupac a superstar and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. He was also a former college football player with alleged ties to the Bloods gang, and a reputation for intimidation and violence that was legendary even by music industry standards. Stories about him were everywhere, dangling vanilla ice off a balcony to secure publishing rights, assaulting people at industry events, running death row like a criminal enterprise with platinum plaques on the walls. He had been in the car with Tupac when the shooting happened, sitting in the driver's seat of the black BMW that had rolled to a stop after the white Cadillac pulled alongside them at the red light. He had walked away with barely a scratch while Tupac had taken 4 bullets. That fact alone had made Knight a suspect in some conspiracy theories, people claiming he had orchestrated the hit over contract disputes and money. But Ava found that theory didn't quite fit when she really dug into the financials. Knight needed Tupac alive. The rapper was Death Row's biggest asset, bigger even than Snoop Dogg or the rest of the roster. His album sold millions. His cultural impact was immeasurable. All Eyes on Me had gone diamond. The Machiavelli album was tracking to go multi-platinum, even though it released after his death. Killing. Tupac made no financial sense when the man was actively generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue. But helping him disappear? That was a different calculation entirely. Ava spent a week in Los Angeles, digging into Death Row's financial records from that period. She pieced together information from court documents, bankruptcy filings that came years later when the label finally imploded, and interviews with former employees who were willing to talk now that Knight was serving time in prison for an unrelated manslaughter charge. The picture that emerged was troubling. Death Row Records in 1996 was a powder keg wrapped in platinum records. The label was bringing in massive revenue, but it was also bleeding money through mismanagement, legal fees, and what one accountant called off-book expenses that were almost certainly money laundering for gang operations. Federal investigators were circling, looking into racketeering and organised crime connections. The FBI had opened files on multiple death row executives. Gang affiliations that had once been useful for street credibility were becoming serious legal liabilities, and Tupac himself had been growing increasingly vocal about wanting to leave death row and start his own label. He had signed with death row while in prison, desperate for the $1 million bail Knight had posted. But now that he was out, now that he had fulfilled his contract obligations, he was looking for an exit. The problem was that Knight didn't let people leave. Not alive anyway. Too many people knew too much about how death row really operated. What if the shooting had been real, but the death had been staged? What if Knight had seen an opportunity to get Tupac out of the line of fire, while also protecting the label's most valuable brand, and keeping federal investigators from getting their hands on a cooperating witness? A dead Tupac was worth more than a living one in some ways. No more legal troubles, no more unpredictable behaviour, no more risk of him testifying about death row's operations or jumping to a competitor. Just a legacy that could be monetised forever without any of the complications of dealing with the actual human being. Ava found something else interesting when she interviewed a forensics expert who specialised in death certificates and autopsy reports. The expert, a retired county coroner named Patricia Williams, who had handled thousands of cases during her career, agreed to review what little public information existed about Tupac's autopsy. They met at Williams' home in San Diego, a modest house filled with medical textbooks and forensic journals. Williams was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and sceptical by nature, someone who had spent a career dealing with families who didn't want to accept how their loved ones had died. "The thing about the Tupac case that always bothered me," Williams said, spreading out copies of the limited autopsy findings on her dining room table, "is that for such a high-profile death, there's remarkably little documentation available. Usually celebrity deaths get exhaustive examination because everyone wants to avoid even a hint of impropriety. But here, the full autopsy report was sealed, with only the most basic details released. That's unusual." "Could there be legitimate reasons for sealing it?" Ava asked. Williams nodded. "Sure. Family privacy, ongoing investigation, all the usual reasons. But it's been almost 30 years. Most sealed documents get released eventually, even if it takes decades. This one hasn't budged. That tells me someone with serious influence wants it to stay sealed." "What about the cremation? I've read that the body was cremated very quickly after the funeral." "Within 24 hours, Williams confirmed. "Again, not impossible, but fast. Cremation destroys all physical evidence. Once you burn a body, you can't go back and retest for toxicology, can't examine wound patterns, can't verify identity through DNA. It's final in a way that burial isn't. So if someone wanted to fake a death, cremation would be the way to do it?" Williams leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "I'm not saying that's what happened, but if I were writing a manual on how to fake a celebrity death, yes, I would include immediate cremation on the checklist, along with a closed casket funeral, limited autopsy release and quick disposal of any physical evidence that could be independently verified later." Ava made detailed notes. The pattern kept repeating. Every procedural decision made in the days after Tupac's shooting had the effect of making verification impossible. Maybe that was coincidence, or maybe it was design. The funeral itself had been unusually private for someone of Tupac's celebrity status. The memorial service at the Frankie Campbell Funeral Chapel in New York was closed to media for the first hour, with only family and close friends allowed inside. Security was tight. enforced by men who looked more like bodyguards than funeral home staff. By the time reporters were permitted entry for the public viewing, the casket was already closed, sealed with brass screws. No one outside the immediate family ever saw Tupac's body except, allegedly, the medical examiner and the mortician. But Ava had found something interesting about that mortician. His name was Charles Henderson, and he had worked for the funeral home for 3 decades, handling services for everyone from mob bosses to mayors. She tracked him down to a retirement community in Florida, where he agreed to speak with her on condition that she didn't record the conversation. Henderson was 82 now, frail but mentally sharp. They sat in his small apartment while he drank iced tea and talked about a career spent preparing dead bodies for their final public appearances. "I remember the Shakur service," he said quietly. "How could I forget? It was chaos, security everywhere, family members crying, fans outside the building screaming. The pressure was intense to handle everything perfectly." "Do you remember preparing the body?" Ava asked, keeping her voice gentle. Henderson was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I signed confidentiality agreements, multiple agreements, more paperwork than I'd ever seen for a funeral service. They told me if I ever spoke about what I saw, I could be sued for everything I owned." "It's been 30 years, Ava said. "Whatever you signed probably has limitations." "Maybe." He looked out the window at the Florida sunshine, his expression distant. "All I'll say is this. In my career, I prepared thousands of bodies. I knew what gunshot wounds looked like. I knew what a body looked like after 6 days in intensive care, after multiple surgeries, after fighting for life and losing. And what I prepared for that service didn't match what the medical records described. That's all I can say. Draw your own conclusions." Ava's hands trembled as she wrote down his words. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. The body in that casket hadn't been Tupac. But if that was true, where was the real Tupac? And what did the jar have to do with anything? She found a possible answer in the culture of hip-hop itself. After extensive research and consultation with cultural anthropologists, she discovered that carrying ash or earth from your homeland was a practice in some African and Caribbean cultures, a way of maintaining connection to your roots even when far from home. Tupac's mother, Afeni, had been a Black Panther with strong ties to revolutionary movements and African spiritual practices. She had raised her son with a deep awareness of African heritage and the importance of maintaining cultural identity even in diaspora. What if the jar contained ash from somewhere significant to Tupac? What if it was part of a ritual, a symbolic carrying of his identity to his new life? In some traditions, carrying earth from your birthplace or a sacred place was believed to protect the traveller and maintain their connection to their ancestors. The anonymous emailer had mentioned it specifically, one jar. As if the jar itself was proof, evidence of the plan, a tangible object that connected the shooting in Las Vegas to the man in Belize to whatever life Tupac might be living now. If Tupac had truly planned to fake his death and start a new life, bringing that jar would make sense. It would be a way of carrying his true self into exile, a spiritual anchor in a life built on lies and false identities. Ava needed to find that jar. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of the escape plan. She continued tracking shipping records. After another week of tedious research, multiple Freedom of Information requests, and help from her source inside the port of Los Angeles, she found what she was looking for. In late September 1996, several large crates labelled Equipment Audiovisual Promo were shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City, Florida. The shipment was registered to a company called Eagle Shadow Logistics, a firm that had no website, no public business listings, and no record of existence after 1997. Eagle Shadow. The same phrase from the anonymous email that had started this investigation 3 months ago. The crates themselves were large enough to hold studio equipment, which made the shipment seem routine at first glance. Death Row regularly shipped recording equipment to various locations for promotional events and studio sessions. But Ava noticed something odd about the timing. The shipment was processed on September 10th, just 3 days before Tupac was officially pronounced dead, and the destination, Panama City, was a coastal hub with easy access to Central and South America by boat. The shipping manifest listed the contents as audio mixing boards, microphones, amplifiers, with a declared value that seemed suspiciously low for that much equipment. The total weight was listed as over 800 pounds, but the freight cost was minimal, suggesting someone with connections in the shipping industry had helped facilitate the transfer without too much scrutiny. She began to see the outline of a plan that was audacious in its scope but possible with the right resources and connections, and Marion Knight, whatever else he was, had both resources and connections in abundance. ECT-4, the escape plan. Ava constructed a timeline based on everything she had gathered. It was speculative, she knew, but it fit the available evidence better than the official story. September 7th, 11:17 at night. Tupac is shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. He's rushed to University Medical Center in critical condition. The shooting is real. The wounds are life-threatening, but he survives the initial trauma. September 8th and 9th, Tupac undergoes surgery. His right lung is removed. He is placed in intensive care. The official story says he remained in the hospital fighting for his life. But what if something else happened during this time? Ava found a notation in the hospital record she'd obtained, a single line that appeared in the ICU log for September 9th. Patient transferred to secure site. Identity withheld per federal protocol. Federal protocol. That suggested law enforcement or government involvement. Witness protection, maybe? Or something less official? September 10th. Early morning hours. Ava's theory diverged sharply from the official narrative at this point. She believed that Tupac was transferred out of University Medical Center under heavy security in the middle of the night. In his place, a body was prepared for eventual public display, a body similar enough in age and race to pass a cursory examination, but one that would never be subjected to close scrutiny because it would be cremated within days. The real Tupac, injured but stable, was transported to a private airfield outside Las Vegas. Ava had found a flight log that supported this theory. A small charter aircraft registered to an escrow company called Eagle Shadow Holdings departed from a private terminal at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport on September 10th at 6:15 in the morning. The flight plan listed the destination as Belize City International Airport. The passenger manifest showed 3 individuals, but their names were redacted in the copy she obtained. September 13th. Tupac Shakur is officially pronounced dead at University Medical Center. The announcement is made to the media. The world mourns. The conspiracy theories begin immediately, but most people dismiss them as grief-fueled denial. Meanwhile, if Ava's theory was correct, the real Tupac was recovering in a safe house in Belize, thousands of miles from the media circus and the gang violence that had nearly killed him. She returned to Belize in late July to follow up on the flight log. The private airfield where the plane would have landed was now defunct, converted to commercial use. But she tracked down a former air traffic controller who had worked there in the 90s. His name was Carlos, and he agreed to meet her at a cafe in Belize City. He was in his 60s now, retired, and seemed amused by her questions. "You're not the first person to ask about that time," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. There was a flight, September 1996. I remember because it was unusual. Middle of the night, no advance notice, and when the plane landed there were men with guns waiting. Security, I assumed. Private contractors. "Did you see the passengers?" Ava asked. Carlos nodded slowly. 3 people got off the plane. 2 were large men, bodyguards maybe. The third was smaller, wrapped in blankets, moving slowly like he was hurt. They put him in a car and drove away very fast. I never saw where they went. Did you see his face? No, but I saw his arm when the blanket slipped, covered in tattoos, very distinctive. I remembered thinking he must be someone important to have that kind of security. Ava felt a chill run through her. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was another piece that fit the puzzle. She also discovered something else during her research. In early 1997, just a few months after Tupac's death, a trust was established in Malaysia under the name Tariq Amaru. The trust documents, which she obtained through a contact in international finance, listed Tupac Amaru Shakur Trust as the beneficiary entity. The trust was designed to hold and distribute assets, including intellectual property rights and royalty payments. Tariq Amaru, almost an anagram of Tupac Amaru, too close to be coincidence. When she contacted the law firm managing the trust, she received a terse response. File sealed for privacy. No comment. Act 5. The risks of remaining dead. Ava sat in her apartment in Los Angeles, surrounded by evidence boards and timelines pinned to the walls. Papers were everywhere, spreading from her desk to the floor to the kitchen counter. Coffee cups formed rings on documents. Post-it notes covered every surface with questions, connections, and lists to follow. She had been investigating for 3 months now, and the weight of what she had uncovered was becoming overwhelming. She wasn't just chasing a conspiracy theory anymore. She was reconstructing what might be one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern celebrity history. But she kept asking herself the same question. Why? Why would Tupac choose to remain dead if he had survived? The answer, she realised, came down to survival and legacy. The threats against Tupac in 1996 were very real and came from every direction. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry had escalated from lyrical battles into actual violence, with shots fired at industry events and real blood spilled on city streets. The notorious Big, Tupac's childhood friend turned bitter rival, would be murdered just 6 months after Tupac's death in a still unsolved shooting eerily similar to the one that had nearly killed Tupac. That murder would remain unsolved too, suggesting the same forces that wanted Tupac dead had succeeded with his former friend. Gang affiliations that had once been just street credibility had become serious liabilities. Tupac's association with the Bloods through Death Row Records put him in the crosshairs of their rivals. His outspoken nature, his refusal to back down from confrontation, his tendency to turn every slight into a public feud, had made him enemies in the music industry, in law enforcement, and on the streets. He had been shot multiple times before the Las Vegas incident. He had been arrested repeatedly. He had served time in prison. The walls were closing in from every side. Staying dead meant staying safe. It meant his enemies would stop looking for him. It meant he could live out his life without constantly watching over his shoulder, without worrying that every corner he turned might be his last, without wondering if the next car that pulled up beside him would be the one that finished what the white Cadillac had started. There was also the matter of his commercial legacy. Tupac alive and aging would have been just another rapper trying to stay relevant in a changing industry, competing with younger artists, watching his influence fade as new styles and sounds took over. He would have had to deal with the mundane realities of a music career, contract negotiations, marketing decisions, the slow decline that came for every artist eventually. But Tupac, dead at 25, became immortal. His albums continued to sell millions of copies. Unreleased material was packaged and released for years after his death, generating revenue that would have made him one of the wealthiest figures in hip-hop if he had lived to collect it. His image appeared on t-shirts, posters, murals. His lyrics were quoted in college courses. He became more than a rapper. He became an icon, a martyr, a symbol of everything the culture represented. The question was, did he collect it? Ava found evidence suggesting that someone was managing Tupac's estate in ways that didn't quite make sense if he was actually dead. The Tariq Amaru Trust in Malaysia was just the beginning. She discovered real estate purchases in New Mexico under shell companies with names that referenced Tupac's aliases and lyrics. She found bank transfers moving money through accounts in Cuba, a country where Americans were restricted from doing business, but where Tupac's mother, Afeni, had known political connections through her work with political refugees and revolutionary movements. One purchase in particular caught her attention, a property in rural New Mexico near a Navajo reservation, acquired in 1998 by a company called Machiavelli Holdings. The property was remote, off-grid, and completely private. Satellite imagery showed a compound with multiple buildings, solar panels, and enough land to be completely self-sufficient. Public records showed it was still owned by the same company, with property taxes paid regularly every year. Someone was maintaining that property. Someone was living there, or at least keeping it operational. Who was paying those taxes? Who owned Machiavelli Holdings? The corporate filings led to another shell company registered in Delaware, which led to another registered in the Cayman Islands, which led to another in Panama, creating a web of legal entities designed to obscure the ultimate owner. It was the kind of corporate structure used by people who had something serious to hide. Ava spent 2 weeks trying to unravel the ownership chain. She paid for specialised database searches. She contacted corporate attorneys who specialised in international business law. She followed money trails through offshore accounts and dummy corporations, and at the end of it all she found that the trail led back to a single point of origin, a trust established in 1997, just months after Tupac's death, with instructions that the beneficial owner's identity would remain sealed until the year 2045, nearly 50 years after the trust's creation. Who sets up a trust that locks identity information for 50 years unless they have something massive to hide? She also discovered something interesting about Tupac's posthumous releases. Between 1996 and 2006, 7 full albums of Tupac's music were released. Some were compilations of old material, remixes, and alternate versions of songs that had appeared on earlier albums. But others contained songs that had never been heard before. Tracks that nobody in the industry could account for based on known recording sessions. The official explanation was that Tupac had been incredibly prolific during his short career, recording hundreds of tracks that were being released gradually after his death, as his estate and label worked through the archive. Death Row and later Amaru Entertainment, the label Afeni had formed to control her son's legacy, claimed they had vaults full of unreleased material. But some audio engineers who analysed the posthumous tracks told a different story. Ava interviewed 3 different audio forensics experts, professionals who worked with law enforcement to verify voice recordings and detect audio manipulation. They pointed to subtle differences in recording quality, production techniques, and even vocal patterns that suggested some of the later tracks might have been recorded after Tupac's official death date. "Listen to the background noise on some of these tracks," one engineer told her, playing sections of a posthumous album through professional monitoring equipment. "The ambient sound signature doesn't match Death Row Studios or any other facility we can verify Tupac recorded at, and the vocal quality is different. Not worse, just different. Like he was recording in a different environment, maybe even using different equipment." Another engineer pointed out inconsistencies in Tupac's voice itself. The timbre and resonance patterns on some of these later tracks suggest his vocal cords had fully matured, that he had aged past 25. It's subtle, but it's there. The voice has more depth, more resonance in the lower registers. That's not something you can fake with production tricks. The theories were dismissed as conspiracy nonsense by most music industry professionals. Death Row and Amaru Entertainment released statements saying all the posthumous material had been recorded before Tupac's death. Music critics called the audio forensics claims pseudoscience. But Ava wondered if there was more to it. What if Tupac hadn't just faked his death? What if he had continued recording music in secret, feeding new material to his estate to be released gradually, maintaining his presence in the culture without revealing himself? It would explain how the posthumous releases kept coming year after year, without the quality declining or the material running out. It would explain the inconsistencies the audio engineers had noticed. It would explain why his estate seemed so carefully managed, as if someone with intimate knowledge of his artistic vision was still making decisions about which tracks to release and when. It would be an extraordinary level of deception, requiring careful coordination between Tupac, his mother, trusted engineers and producers, and possibly even law enforcement or intelligence agencies. But then again, Tupac had been an extraordinary figure, a poet, an actor, a revolutionary thinker who had read Machiavelli in prison and understood that sometimes the greatest power came from appearing powerless, from being dead while actually alive, from controlling your legacy by removing yourself from it entirely. If anyone could pull off a deception that elaborate, it would be Tupac Amaru Shakur. Aced 6. The decision point. By late August, Ava had compiled everything she'd gathered into a comprehensive report that ran over 100 pages. She had the ambulance logs with their mysterious VIP Code 3 and personal effects listing. She had the shipping records for Eagle Shadow Logistics. She had the flight manifest showing a charter plane leaving Las Vegas for Belize the morning after the shooting. She had the trust documents from Malaysia. She had witness testimonies from Rosa in Belize and Carlos, the air traffic controller. She had the statement from Charles Henderson, the mortician who had prepared a body that didn't match the medical records. She had the audio forensics suggesting posthumous tracks were recorded after Tupac's death. And she had the strange gaps in the official narrative that had never been adequately explained. Most importantly, she had traced the mystery of the jar. The sealed glass container mentioned in the ambulance log, the jar Rosa had seen in Belize, the symbolic carrying of sacred earth from home. It all connected. The jar was physical evidence that tied everything together, proof that someone matching Tupac's description had travelled from Las Vegas to Belize carrying something deeply personal, something connected to his identity and heritage. She knew that publishing this story would make her a target. She knew that powerful people had reasons to keep the truth hidden, whatever that truth actually was. Death Row Records might be defunct, but Marion Knight still had connections. The people who had helped fake Tupac's death, if that's what had happened, wouldn't want their roles exposed. And if federal agencies had been involved, which the sealed files suggested, then she would be challenging forces far more dangerous than any record label executive. But she also knew that journalism existed for moments like this, for stories that challenged official narratives and forced difficult questions into the public sphere. This was why she had become a reporter, not to write puff pieces about album releases, but to uncover truth that powerful people wanted buried. She decided to do something bold. Rather than publishing a traditional article that could be ignored or dismissed, she would host a live-streamed presentation where she revealed her findings in real time, allowing the audience to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions. A live stream couldn't be stopped once it started. It couldn't be edited or suppressed by editors worried about lawsuits. And if thousands of people watched it happen in real time, the information couldn't be disappeared even if something happened to her afterward. She spent a week preparing. She created a PowerPoint presentation with scanned documents, photographs, and audio, clips. She rehearsed her delivery until she could present the entire investigation clearly and compellingly. She set up multiple backup servers to host the stream, knowing that whoever wanted this buried might try to take her offline. She notified several trusted journalist friends about the stream time, asking them to save copies in case her originals disappeared. The stream was scheduled for August 22nd, 2025, at 8 in the evening Pacific time. She promoted it on social media for 3 days beforehand with cryptic messages. The truth about Tupac Shakur. 29 years of lies end Thursday night. What really happened in Las Vegas? The anticipation built. Hip-hop forums exploded with speculation. Music news sites picked up the story. By the day of the stream, she had over 50,000 people registered to watch. The stream went live at 8 sharp. Within minutes, the viewer count climbed past 100,000. Within half an hour, it had gone viral, shared across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram and Reddit. News outlets started covering it in real time. By the time she was an hour into her presentation, over 1 million people were watching. Ava sat in front of her camera, her apartment's evidence board visible behind her, and walked through her investigation step by step. She started with the anonymous email that had begun everything, explaining the cryptic message: "Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th, 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar." "I followed that shadow," she told the camera, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And what I found raises questions that have never been properly answered about the death of the most influential rapper of his generation." She showed the ambulance log with patient 1724 and VIP code 3. She zoomed in on the line about personal effects, 1 sealed glass container. "This jar appears again in Belize," she explained, "carried by a man matching Tupac's description, who told a guest house owner it contained something sacred from home. In some African and Caribbean cultures, carrying earth or ash from your homeland is a way of maintaining spiritual connection when in exile. Was Tupac carrying a piece of himself into his new life?" She displayed the shipping manifest for Eagle Shadow Logistics, highlighting the timing. Equipment shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City 3 days before Tupac was pronounced dead. The same company name that appeared in the anonymous email. A company that ceased to exist after 1997. She played audio from her interview with the former death row security guard, his voice disguised for protection. "I heard someone mention extraction and Latin America branch. People don't use that language for moving studio equipment. They use it for moving people." She showed photographs of the property in New Mexico, obtained through public records requests and satellite imagery. A compound owned by Machiavelli Holdings, maintained for over 25 years, purchased through a web of shell companies designed to hide the true owner. Who's living there? Who's been paying the property taxes for a quarter century? She explained the web of trusts and offshore accounts, the money flowing through Cuba and Malaysia, the corporate structures designed for maximum secrecy. This isn't how you manage the estate of a dead celebrity. This is how you hide a living person's financial activity. She played the audio forensics analysis, letting viewers hear the subtle differences in vocal resonance on posthumous tracks. 3 independent audio engineers have told me these tracks show signs of being recorded years after Tupac's official death date. The music industry dismissed their findings, but science doesn't lie. She discussed the Belize sightings in detail, showing photographs Rosa had taken of the beach, where the tattooed man had swum at night. The testimony from Carlos about the mysterious flight and the injured passenger with distinctive tattoos. Multiple witnesses, decades apart, telling consistent stories about a man who looked like Tupac, had his tattoos, his mannerisms, his voice. Then she dropped the biggest bombshell, her interview with Charles Henderson, the mortician. She didn't show his face or use his name, but she quoted him directly. In his career, preparing thousands of bodies, he knew what gunshot wounds looked like, and what he prepared for Tupac's funeral didn't match the medical records. That's not speculation. That's the professional assessment of someone who handled the body. She paused, letting that sink in for her massive audience. "I am not saying definitively that Tupac Shakur is alive," she told the camera, looking directly into the lens. "What I'm saying is that there are too many unanswered questions. Too many inconsistencies, too many pieces of evidence that don't fit the official story. Whether Tupac survived or not, something happened that night, and in the days that followed that we have not been told about. Someone went to great lengths to make verification impossible. The cremation, the sealed autopsy, the closed casket, the federal seals on hospital records. That's not how innocent people behave. That's not how you handle a straightforward case of gang violence." She ended with direct appeal, her voice rising with passion. If the most iconic figure in hip-hop history faked his death, it raises fundamental questions about truth, identity, power, and the manipulation of public narrative. These are questions we should be asking about our culture, about the industry, about what we believe and why we believe it. How many other stories have we accepted without examination? How many other legends are built on lies? And if Tupac Shakur did survive, if he's out there somewhere living under a different name, Does he deserve the peace he's found? Or does the public have a right to know the truth? The stream ended after 2 hours and 15 minutes. The chat had been scrolling too fast to read, thousands of messages per second. The viewer count had peaked at over 2 million people watching simultaneously. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with debate. Hashtags trended worldwide. Tupac lives, Machiavelli returns, Ava Ramirez. Some called her a hero for investigative journalism, a truth-teller who had done what mainstream media was too cowardly or compromised to attempt. Others called her a fraud peddling conspiracy theories for clicks, a clout chaser exploiting a dead man's legacy for personal gain. Major news outlets reached out for interviews. Her website crashed from traffic within minutes, even with the backup servers running. By morning, she had over 100 media requests in her inbox, and then the threat started. At first, they were generic trolling, the kind of harassment any woman with a public platform receives, but within 24 hours they became specific and credible. Her email inbox filled with anonymous messages warning her to stop digging, containing details about her daily routine that proved someone was watching her. Her home address was posted on multiple forums. Her social media accounts were flooded with harassment so intense she had to disable comments entirely. Someone sent her a package at her apartment building. When she opened it, she found a printed photo of her building taken from across the street, with a red X drawn over her window in marker. No note, no explanation, just the image and the implication. 2 days after the stream, her website was hit with a massive distributed denial of service attack that took it offline for 3 days. Her hosting provider told her it was one of the most sophisticated attacks they had ever seen, originating from multiple countries simultaneously, using methods typically associated with state-sponsored hacking groups. This isn't random hacktivists, the security specialist told her. Someone with serious resources wants you silenced. Most troubling of all, her contact in Belize, Michael Agas, went completely silent. His videos stopped appearing online. His email bounced back with a message saying the account didn't exist. When she tried to reach out to mutual contacts in San Pedro, they told her he had left the country suddenly, in the middle of the night, leaving his belongings behind. One person said they'd seen men in suits asking about him at the bars where he used to hang out. Another said they heard a boat had picked him up from the beach and headed south toward Guatemala. Rosa, the guest house owner who had told her about the tattooed man with the jar, stopped returning her calls. When Ava finally reached her daughter, she was told, "My mother says she doesn't want to talk anymore. She says the past should stay in the past. Please don't contact us again." Carlos, the air traffic controller in Belize City, sent her a single text message. "They know I talked to you. I'm sorry. I can't help anymore. Delete my number." One by one, her sources were disappearing or being silenced. Ava realised she'd kicked a hornet's nest. Someone was very interested in making sure her investigation didn't go any further. The question was, who? And how far would they go to protect a secret that was almost 30 years old? She didn't sleep for 3 days after the stream, jumping at every sound in her apartment building, checking the locks on her door obsessively, keeping a baseball bat by her bed. She knew she should be scared. She was scared. But she also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She had done something that mattered. She had asked questions that needed asking, and whatever happened next, at least she had told the truth as best she could determine it. Or at least she had raised enough doubt about the official story that people would never look at Tupac's death the same way again. Epilogue. It was late September now, almost exactly 29 years since Tupac had been shot on the Las Vegas Strip. Ava sat in a hotel room in Miami, far from her apartment in Los Angeles, which no longer felt safe. The room was generic, the kind of anonymous space that existed in every city. Beige walls, generic art prints, the smell of industrial cleaning products trying to mask decades of previous occupants. She had checked in under a fake name, paid cash, and told no one where she was going. She had backed up all her files to secure cloud storage, encrypted everything twice, and shared copies with 3 trusted journalists she had worked with over the years, people who would publish the material if anything happened to her. She had written detailed instructions about where all her sources were, how to verify the evidence, who to contact if she went silent. It was the kind of preparation you made when you knew you had become a target. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had intensified. But she was still alive, still working, still digging. That had to count for something. She opened her laptop and scrolled through Reddit threads, watching the conspiracy community react to her revelations. The discussions had exploded across multiple forums and platforms. The documentary subreddit had a mega thread with over 15,000 comments analysing every piece of evidence she had presented. Hip-hop forums were debating whether the audio forensics proved anything, or were just wishful thinking dressed up as science. True crime communities were cross-referencing her findings with other cold cases, looking for patterns. People were sharing their own theories, their own sightings, their own pieces of evidence that they claimed supported her investigation. Some of it was ridiculous, the kind of obviously fabricated stories that conspiracy theories attracted. But some of it was intriguing. Detailed accounts from people who claimed to have seen someone matching Tupac's, description in various locations over the years. All of it showed how deeply Tupac's death, or alleged death, had impacted the culture. One thread caught her attention. It was titled Pac in Cuba, Pac in Malaysia, Pac in New Mexico, Mapping the Sightings. Users had created an interactive map showing every reported Tupac sighting since 1996, colour-coded by credibility and cross-referenced with the evidence Ava had presented in her stream. Green markers indicated high-credibility sightings with multiple witnesses or photographic evidence. Yellow markers were possible sightings with limited verification. Red markers were obviously false claims. The map showed clusters in Central America, Southeast Asia, and the American Southwest. The pattern was too consistent to be random chance, but too scattered to prove anything definitive. It was like looking at a constellation and trying to decide if the stars formed a picture, or if your brain was just imposing order on chaos. Ava clicked on a green marker in New Mexico, not far from where she'd identified the Machiavelli Holdings property. The entry described a sighting from 2012 by a local artist who claimed to have met a man at a Navajo reservation who looked remarkably like Tupac, though older and quieter. He spoke about hip-hop like someone who had lived it, the artist wrote. Not like a fan, but like someone who had been in the middle of it all. He mentioned the East Coast, West Coast thing with this sadness in his voice, like he was talking about old friends who had died. When I asked his name, he said to call him Amaru. I didn't think anything of it until later. Amaru, Tupac's middle name, the name used for the Malaysian Trust. A breadcrumb or a coincidence? She switched to a different tab, reading through emails from people who had watched her stream. Most were supportive, thanking her for her courage and her journalism. Some were from people claiming to have additional evidence, though most of those led nowhere when she followed up. A few were from music industry insiders, speaking off the record, telling her she was onto something but to be careful because people had disappeared for asking fewer questions than she had asked. One email stood out. It had arrived that morning from an address that appeared to be randomly generated. The subject line was blank, just like the original anonymous email that had started everything. The message was brief. The jar is still sealed. Some truths are buried for good reason. You've done your part. Now let the legend rest. She stared at the message, trying to parse its meaning. Was it a threat? A warning? Or confirmation from someone who knew the truth? Ava opened her journal, a physical notebook she kept for her own thoughts separate from her digital files. The pages were filled with 3 months of notes, observations, questions that still had no answers. She turned to a blank page and began to write, her hand moving across the paper in the dim light of the hotel room. 3 months ago, I received an anonymous email that changed everything. Follow the eagle's shadow, it said. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. I followed that shadow as far as I could, and I found evidence of something extraordinary. Not proof, but evidence. Enough to know that the official story doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Enough to know that powerful people wanted this buried. Enough to know that the truth, whatever it is, has been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Did Tupac Shakur survive September 7th, 1996? I don't know. I may never know for certain. But I know this. Machiavelli lives in the questions we're afraid to ask, in the narratives we accept without examination, in the spaces between what we're told and what we're allowed to know. He said Machiavelli lives, and if he does, we owe him the truth. Not the comfortable lie of martyrdom, not the sanitized legend of a fallen icon, but the messy, complicated, dangerous truth of a man who might have chosen to disappear rather than die. That truth is worth fighting for, even if it costs me everything. She closed the journal and looked out the hotel window at the Miami skyline. The city glowed in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of people, each one living their own version of truth and lies. Somewhere out there, in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or Cuba or 1,000 other places, someone might be living under a different name with a different face, with the same tattoos and the same voice and the same fire that had made Tupac Shakur immortal even before his alleged death. Or maybe he really was gone, and she had spent 3 months chasing shadows and connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. Maybe the pattern she had found was just the human mind's desperate attempt to impose meaning on chaos, to find conspiracy in tragedy, to believe that someone as vital and alive as Tupac couldn't simply be snuffed out by random violence on a Vegas street. Either way, the investigation had revealed something important, that in an age of information and surveillance it was still possible to disappear. It was still possible to control your own narrative, even from beyond the grave. It was still possible to become legend by choosing when and how your story ended, by taking yourself out of the equation and letting the myth grow in your absence. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She checked it, expecting another threat or another journalist looking for an interview or another conspiracy theorist claiming to have the missing piece of the puzzle. Instead, it was from the same scrambled sender who had contacted her back in May, the one who had sent the original invitation to follow the eagle's shadow. The subject line was still blank. The message contained only 3 words, no signature, no explanation. He sends regards. Ava stared at the screen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she screenshot the message and saved it to her encrypted backup. She didn't know if it was real or another layer of deception. She didn't know if she should feel validated or terrified. She didn't know if he meant Tupac or someone else entirely. Someone using the legend to manipulate her, to keep her chasing ghosts while the real truth stayed hidden. She didn't know anything for certain anymore, except that certainty itself might be the biggest lie of all. But she knew she couldn't stop now. Stopping meant letting them win, whoever they were. Stopping meant accepting that some truths were too dangerous to pursue, that some questions were better left unasked. And she hadn't become a journalist to accept comfortable lies. She had become a journalist to make people uncomfortable with the truth. She opened a new document and began typing the outline for her next investigation, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind already racing ahead to the next lead, the next question, the next shadow to follow. She would dig into the Malaysian trust, try to find someone who knew who had set it up. She would visit the New Mexico property, see if she could get close enough to observe who was living there. She would follow the money trails she hadn't had time to fully explore, trace every dollar that had flowed through Tupac's estate in the years since his death. Because that's what journalists do. They chase the truth, wherever it leads, whatever the cost. Even when the truth refuses to reveal itself clearly, even when the answers create more questions, even when powerful forces want them to stop asking. And sometimes, if they're very lucky or very unlucky, they find something that changes everything. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Miami, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, colours so vivid they looked artificial. like someone had turned up the saturation to make the world seem more beautiful than it really was. In the distance, she could hear sirens, the ambient soundtrack of urban life, emergency and crisis and human drama playing out in 1,000 small ways across the city. In her earbuds, an old Tupac track played softly, the one from the Don Killuminati album, the one where he rapped about death and rebirth and revenge from beyond the grave. The lyrics seemed to take on new meaning now, as if he had been telling everyone exactly what he planned to do, and no one had believed him because the truth was too outrageous to accept. He had studied Machiavelli in prison. He had learned that the greatest trick was making your enemies think they had won. And maybe, just maybe, he had pulled off the greatest trick of all. Machiavelli lives, he had said, and maybe, just maybe, he was right. Not as the 25-year-old rapper frozen in time by bullets and legend, but as something else, something transformed, something that had chosen to become myth rather than remain mortal. The track ended, and another began, his voice filling her ears with words about thug life and enemies, and surviving against impossible odds. She let it play, let the poetry wash over her, and wondered if somewhere in those lyrics was another clue, another breadcrumb on a trail that might lead nowhere or might lead everywhere. She would keep looking, keep asking, keep digging, even if it took another 3 months or 3 years or 3 decades, because the story wasn't over. It might never be over, and that was okay. Some stories weren't meant to have endings. They were meant to keep unfolding, generation after generation, truth mixing with legend until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. That was Tupac's real legacy, she realised. Not the music or the movies or the revolutionary politics, though all of those mattered. His real legacy was teaching an entire culture to question the official story, to look for the truth beneath the surface, to never accept simple answers to complicated questions. He had made skepticism hip, and in doing so, he had created the conditions for his own possible resurrection, because a culture trained to question everything would never stop questioning whether he was really gone. Fade to black. Archival footage plays, showing the flashing lights of an ambulance reflecting off wet pavement on a desert road late at night, September the 7th, 1996. The beginning of a mystery that might never be solved, a legend that would outlive whatever truth had been buried beneath it. The camera lingers on the lights, red and white and blue, pulsing against the darkness like a heartbeat, like proof of life, like a signal to anyone watching that something happened here that changed everything. Then slowly, inexorably, the lights fade to nothing, leaving only darkness and the sound of breathing, of waiting, of questions that echo into silence without answers. But in that silence, if you listen closely, you might hear something. A voice, distant and distorted, rapping about living forever, about being more than flesh and bone, about becoming legend. Or maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's just your mind creating patterns where none exist, hearing what you want to hear because the alternative is too painful to accept. Either way, the mystery endures, the questions remain, and somewhere, maybe in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or nowhere at all, Machiavelli might be smiling at how well the plan worked. End. Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious about you, our listeners. How has your day been treating you? Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world, just beginning your morning routine. What time is it where you are right now? And what corner of our vast planet are you calling home tonight? Whether you're listening from a bustling city apartment, a quiet countryside home, or somewhere in between, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new to Sleep Theories, welcome aboard. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have so many more mysteries to uncover together, and your subscription helps us bring these stories to light. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous disasters. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, not just to explore the wreckage of a legendary ship, but to uncover a conspiracy so massive, so carefully orchestrated, that it may have shaped the course of world history. This is the story of the Titanic switch, the theory that suggests the ship that sank on that fateful April night in 1912 was never the Titanic at all. April 14th, 1912. Picture this night in your mind. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting nothing but stars. There is no moon to illuminate the waters, leaving the ocean in an almost supernatural darkness. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing, and the sea is unusually calm, so still that veterans of these waters would later describe it as eerily unnatural. Cutting through this obsidian expanse is the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic, all 882 feet of her, pushes through the water at nearly 23 knots. Her 4 massive smokestacks pierce the star-filled sky, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night. From her decks, the warm glow of electric light spills out onto the water, creating the only source of illumination for miles in any direction. Inside this floating palace, over 2,000 souls are living what many believe to be their final hours, though they don't know it yet. In the first-class dining saloon, passengers in evening wear are finishing their 10-course dinner, completely unaware that they are dining aboard what will become history's most famous maritime disaster. The ship's orchestra plays ragtime melodies that drift through the corridors, mixing with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the ever-present thrumming of the engines deep below. Captain Edward Smith stands on the bridge, a veteran of the seas with 40 years of experience behind him. This is meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a triumphant capstone to a distinguished career. He has commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, earning the nickname Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling the luxury vessels that carry the world's elite across the Atlantic. Tonight he commands not just any ship, but the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet, the unsinkable Titanic. But at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, everything changes in an instant. Frederick Fleet, the lookout stationed in the crow's nest, spots something emerging from the darkness ahead. Without the aid of binoculars, which, mysteriously, are locked away and unavailable to the lookouts that night, he strains his eyes against the blackness. What he sees sends ice through his veins. A massive iceberg, dark and silent, looms directly in the ship's path. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet shouts into the telephone that connects him to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. The helmsman spins the wheel, and the engine room receives the telegraph signal to reverse engines. For 37 seconds, the fate of over 2,000 people hangs in the balance as the massive ship begins to turn. But it's too late. The Titanic's starboard side scrapes along the iceberg with what survivors would later describe as a sound like thunder, though to many passengers it felt like nothing more than a slight shudder. Some passengers on the lower decks report chunks of ice falling onto the deck, and a few even gather pieces as souvenirs, joking about their close call with the ice. They have no idea that their ship is already doomed. Below the waterline, the iceberg has opened up the first 5 compartments of the ship's hull. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but 5 is too many. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who is aboard for this maiden voyage, quickly calculates the mathematics of disaster. With 5 compartments flooding, the ship will inevitably sink by the bow, pulling the rest of the vessel down with her. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asks Andrews. "An hour, 2 at most." And so begins one of the most studied, documented and debated disasters in human history. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will break apart and slip beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The survivors will tell stories of heroism and cowardice, of the band playing hymns as the ship tilted toward her grave, of the insufficient lifeboats and the icy water that killed most victims within minutes. This is the story we all know. This is the official narrative that has been told and retold for over a century. But what if everything we think we know about that night is wrong? What if the ship that struck the iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic was never the Titanic at all? What if the real conspiracy began not in the aftermath of the disaster, but months before, in the shipyards of Belfast, where 2 sister ships sat side by side, and where a desperate plan was hatched to save a failing company from financial ruin? What if the disaster that shocked the world was not an accident, but the culmination of the most audacious insurance fraud ever attempted? Tonight, we're going to explore a theory that suggests the Titanic disaster was not just a tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the world. We're going to examine evidence that points to a massive cover-up, one that may have claimed the lives of over 1,500 innocent people in service of greed, power, and political manipulation. This is the story of the Titanic switch, and by the end of our journey together, you may never look at this famous disaster the same way again. To understand the theory of the Titanic switch, we must first travel back to the shipyards of Belfast Island, where 2 virtually identical ships were taking shape side by side. The story begins not with disaster, but with dreams of maritime supremacy and the fierce competition between the great shipping lines of the early 20th century. Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast was, at the time, one of the premier shipbuilding facilities in the world. The massive facility sprawled along the banks of the River Lagan, its enormous gantry cranes towering over the landscape like steel monuments to industrial ambition. It was here, in this cathedral of steel and rivets, that the White Star Line had commissioned 3 ships that would change ocean travel forever. The Olympic-class ships, as they would be known, were conceived as the ultimate expression of luxury and engineering prowess. These were to be the largest, most opulent vessels ever built, designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route and crush the competition from rival shipping companies like Cunard Line. The first of these sister ships was the RMS Olympic, launched on October the 20th, 1910. She was a marvel of engineering, stretching 882 feet from bow to stern and weighing over 46,000 tons. Her 9 decks could accommodate over 2,000 passengers in unprecedented luxury, with amenities that included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The Olympic was not just a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the White Star Line's dominance of the seas. When she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage in June 1911, she carried with her the hopes and reputation of her builders. But less than 4 months after her maiden voyage, disaster struck. On September the 20th, 1911, the Olympic was departing Southampton when she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The impact was devastating. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed to ram enemy vessels, punched a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooding 2 of her compartments and severely damaging her propeller shaft. The Olympic limped back to port, her maiden voyage season cut dramatically short. But the damage was far more extensive than initially apparent. When she was dry docked for inspection, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. The collision had not only opened up her hull and damaged her propeller, but it had also twisted her keel, the backbone of the ship, potentially compromising her structural integrity for the remainder of her operational life. For the White Star Line, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. The Olympic had cost over $7.5 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1911. Now she faced months of expensive repairs, and even after those repairs, questions would remain about her seaworthiness and insurability. But the problems went deeper than just the cost of repairs. The collision with HMS Hawke had occurred under circumstances that placed the Olympic at fault. Captain Edward Smith, yes, the same Captain Smith who would later command the Titanic on her fatal voyage, had been in charge of the Olympic when the accident occurred. The subsequent Admiralty Court inquiry found the Olympic to blame for the collision, meaning that the White Star Line would receive no insurance compensation for the damage. This left the company facing a nightmare scenario. They had an expensive ship that needed costly repairs, no insurance money to pay for those repairs, and serious questions about whether insurance companies would be willing to fully cover the vessel in the future. The Olympic had gone from being the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet to a massive financial liability virtually overnight. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard where the Olympic was undergoing her repairs, work was proceeding on her sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was planned to be virtually identical to her older sister, with only minor modifications and improvements. From a distance, even expert ship observers would have difficulty telling the two vessels apart. They shared the same basic dimensions, the same general layout, the same distinctive four-funnel silhouette that had become the signature of the White Star Line's premium vessels. This similarity, according to the switch theory, was not coincidental. It was the key to a plan that would solve the White Star Line's financial crisis, while simultaneously eliminating a massive liability. The theory suggests that sometime in late 1911 or early 1912, a decision was made at the highest levels of the White Star Line's ownership. Rather than spend millions repairing the Olympic and then operating her under a cloud of doubt about her structural integrity and insurability, they would swap the identities of the two ships. The damaged Olympic would be given the identity of the Titanic and sent out on what was ostensibly the new ship's maiden voyage. But this voyage would not be intended to reach New York. Instead, the disguised Olympic would be deliberately sunk, allowing the White Star Line to collect the full insurance value of a new undamaged vessel while simultaneously eliminating the financial burden of the real Titanic's damaged sister. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would quietly slip into service, her true identity hidden from the world. To understand why such a plan might have been attractive, we must consider the financial pressures facing the White Star Line in 1912. The company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had invested enormous sums in his shipping empire, but the business was facing increasing competition and declining profitability. The White Star Line needed the Titanic to be a success. They needed her to capture public imagination, dominate the headlines, and establish the company's supremacy on the North Atlantic route. But they also needed to resolve the Olympic problem before it bankrupted the entire operation. According to the switch theory, the solution was as elegant as it was terrible. Switch the ships, sink the damaged one while pretending it was the new one, collect the insurance money, and use the real new ship to rebuild the company's reputation and finances. The theory suggests that the work done on both ships during the winter of 1911 and 1912 was not routine maintenance and completion, but rather an elaborate process of swapping their identities. Features that differed between the ships would need to be altered. Documentation would need to be changed or destroyed. Most importantly, the workers involved would need to be either brought into the conspiracy or kept unaware of what they were truly doing. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers, and the shipyard was a maze of activity with multiple vessels under construction and repair simultaneously. In such an environment, it would be possible to make alterations to both ships without arousing suspicion, especially if the changes were explained as routine modifications or improvements. The workers who might notice discrepancies could be told they were simply upgrading the Olympic to match improvements made to the Titanic design, or vice versa. Only a handful of people at the very top of the hierarchy would need to know the true purpose of the work being done. But for such a plan to succeed, it would require more than just physical alterations to the ships. It would require careful planning of the disaster itself, ensuring that the right people were aboard and the right people were not, and that the sinking would occur in circumstances that would prevent too close an examination of the evidence. The switch theory suggests that every detail of the Titanic's maiden voyage was planned not to showcase a magnificent new ship, but to destroy an old damaged one while making it appear to be an accident. The passenger list, the route, the timing, even the crew assignments, all of these, according to the theory, were carefully orchestrated to serve the conspiracy. As we'll see, the evidence for this incredible claim goes far beyond simple speculation. There are photographs that seem to show differences between the ship that left Belfast and the ship that left Southampton. There are testimony from shipyard workers who noticed unusual modifications being made. There are suspicious cancellations by wealthy passengers who had every reason to want to be aboard the maiden voyage of the most famous ship ever built. Most tellingly, there are the financial motivations of the men who controlled the White Star Line. Men who stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and who stood to gain millions if a carefully planned disaster could eliminate their problems while simultaneously collecting insurance payments. But before we examine that evidence, we need to understand exactly who these men were and just how much money was at stake in 1912. We need to understand the insurance motive that may have driven over 1,500 people to their deaths in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Money. In the end, according to the switch theory, that's what the Titanic disaster was really about. Not the romance of the sea, not the hubris of calling a ship unsinkable, not even the class divisions that the disaster seemed to highlight. It was about money, enormous amounts of money that stood to be lost or gained depending on the fate of two ships and the decisions of a few powerful men. To understand the financial pressures that may have driven the conspiracy, we need to understand the business empire of one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who controlled more wealth and power than perhaps any individual in the history of capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature in the world of early 20th century finance. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, had financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial empires. He had personally intervened to prevent financial panics, earning him the nickname America's Bank. When the federal government needed money, they came to J.P. Morgan. When major corporations needed capital, they came to J.P. Morgan. By 1912, he controlled assets worth billions in today's currency. But Morgan's empire was not limited to American shores. In 1902, he had founded the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust designed to dominate transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. The IM acquired control of numerous shipping lines, including the prestigious White Star Line, Morgan's crown jewel in maritime transportation. The White Star Line was the perfect fit for Morgan's vision. Founded in 1845, it had built its reputation on providing luxury service to affluent passengers crossing between Europe and America. The company's ships were known for their elegance, comfort, and safety record. When Morgan acquired control, he saw an opportunity to create the ultimate expression of luxury travel while generating enormous profits. This vision led directly to the commissioning of the Olympic-class ships. Morgan intended these vessels to be more than just transportation. They would be floating advertisements for the supremacy of his shipping empire. The Olympic, Titanic, and the planned third sister ship Britannic would capture the public imagination and establish IMM as the unquestioned leader in North Atlantic travel. The financial investment was staggering. Each ship cost approximately $7.5 million to build, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The Olympic alone represented an investment larger than the annual budget of many small nations. For the three ships combined, Morgan was risking an amount of money that could have funded a small war. But the potential profits were equally enormous. The North Atlantic passenger route was one of the most lucrative transportation businesses in the world. Wealthy Americans travelling to Europe for business or pleasure were willing to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. European aristocrats and businessmen crossing to America represented another steady stream of high-paying customers. Immigrants seeking new lives in America provided volume traffic that, while individually less profitable, generated substantial revenue in aggregate. Morgan calculated that the Olympic-class ships would not only dominate this market but expand it. By offering unprecedented luxury and reliability, he could charge premium prices while attracting new customers who had never before considered ocean travel. The ships would pay for themselves within a few years and then generate enormous profits for decades to come. This was the dream. The reality, as we've seen, was somewhat different. When the Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in September 1911, Morgan's carefully calculated investment began to unravel. The ship that was supposed to be generating revenue was instead sitting in dry dock, requiring expensive repairs. Worse, the legal finding that the Olympic was at fault for the collision meant that insurance would not cover the costs of those repairs. But the problems went beyond just the immediate cost of fixing the damage. The Olympic's accident raised serious questions about the ship's design and safety. If one of these supposedly superior vessels could be so easily damaged in a collision with a smaller ship, what did that say about their construction? More importantly for Morgan's business model, what did it say about their insurability? Insurance was critical to the economics of ship operation. No shipping company could afford to operate vessels worth millions of dollars without comprehensive insurance coverage. But insurance companies were in the business of managing risk, and a ship that had already demonstrated vulnerability might be difficult to insure at reasonable rates. The switch theory suggests that by late 1911, Morgan and his associates realized they faced a potential disaster that went far beyond the cost of repairing one ship. If insurance companies began to question the safety and reliability of the Olympic-class design, it could affect the insurability and profitability of the entire fleet. The Titanic, still under construction, might face higher insurance premiums or coverage limitations based on her sister ship's problems. Even worse, if the Olympic's structural damage was more extensive than initially apparent, the ship might prove to be uneconomical to operate even after repairs. A ship with a damaged keel might suffer from ongoing problems with stability, fuel efficiency, or structural integrity. She might require more frequent and expensive maintenance, reducing her profitability and potentially shortening her operational life. In this context, the switch theory proposes the idea of swapping the ship's identities became attractive, not just as a way to collect insurance money, but as a way to solve multiple problems simultaneously. By sinking the damaged Olympic while disguised as the Titanic, the conspiracy would eliminate the problematic vessel while collecting insurance payments based on the value of a new, undamaged ship. The insurance money would not only compensate for the Olympic's construction costs, but would also provide capital to complete the real Titanic and put her into profitable service. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now operating under the Olympic's identity, would begin generating revenue immediately. Any questions about the Olympic's performance could be explained away as improvements made during her repair period. The beauty of the plan, from a financial standpoint, was that it transformed a major liability into a substantial asset. Instead of losing money on repairs and operating a damaged ship of questionable profitability, the conspiracy would collect full insurance value for a total loss while simultaneously putting an undamaged vessel into service. But for such a plan to work, the insurance aspects would need to be carefully managed. The Titanic was insured for £650,000, approximately $75 million in today's currency. This was a substantial amount, but it was less than the ship's actual construction cost, partly because insurance values were typically set below replacement cost to discourage fraudulent claims. However, the insurance money would still represent a significant recovery of Morgan's investment. Combined with the revenues that the real Titanic could generate while operating as the Olympic, the financial benefits of the switch could potentially exceed the total cost of both ships. The theory also suggests that the conspiracy would have additional financial benefits beyond the immediate insurance recovery. By eliminating the Olympic's problems, Morgan could proceed with his plans for the third sister ship, Britannic, without the cloud of questions about the class's design and safety. The successful maiden voyage of the Titanic would generate publicity and confidence that would benefit the entire White Star Line fleet. But perhaps most intriguingly, the switch theory proposes that the financial motive may have extended beyond simple insurance fraud. Some versions of the theory suggest that the disaster was timed to coincide with other events that would benefit Morgan's broader financial interests. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the United States Federal Reserve System was established. This new central banking system fundamentally changed how American finance operated, and J.P. Morgan was one of its strongest supporters. The Federal Reserve centralized control of American monetary policy and created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in. However, Morgan faced opposition to the Federal Reserve from some quarters, including wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. Some of these opponents happened to be aboard the Titanic when she sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune and a vocal critic of centralized banking, went down with the ship. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another Federal Reserve opponent, died along with his wife. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a skeptic of Morgan's financial schemes, also perished in the disaster. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan himself, who had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, cancelled his trip at the last minute citing illness. Several of Morgan's business associates and political allies also cancelled their bookings while his opponents sailed to their deaths. This aspect of the theory suggests that the Titanic disaster may have served multiple purposes for Morgan. Not only did it solve his immediate problem with the Olympic and provide insurance money, but it also eliminated some of his most powerful opponents in the debate over American financial policy. Whether or not this political dimension was part of the original plan, the financial motive alone would have been sufficient to drive such a conspiracy. Morgan stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and he stood to gain millions if a carefully orchestrated disaster could eliminate his problems while collecting insurance payments. The amounts of money involved were so large that they could influence the decisions of governments and the fate of thousands of people. In the world of early 20th century finance, where a handful of men controlled wealth comparable to entire national budgets, the lives of 1,500 passengers might have seemed like acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger financial strategy. But money and motive alone do not prove a conspiracy. For the switch theory to be credible, there must be physical evidence that the ships were actually swapped. There must be documentation, photographs, and testimony that support the claim that the vessel that sank was not the Titanic but her damaged sister. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory claim that such evidence exists, hidden in plain sight in photographs, construction records, and the testimony of those who were present when the conspiracy was allegedly carried out. The human eye, they say, can be deceived. Photographs, however, do not lie. They capture reality with mechanical precision, preserving details that witnesses might forget or misremember. For proponents of the switch theory, photographic evidence forms the backbone of their case that the ship which sank on April 15, 1912, was not the Titanic, but her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand this evidence, we must first appreciate just how similar the Olympic and Titanic actually were. Both ships were built from virtually identical blueprints, with the same overall dimensions, the same basic layout, and the same distinctive four-funnel profile. From a distance, even maritime experts would have difficulty distinguishing between them. However, they were not absolutely identical. The Titanic incorporated several design improvements based on experience gained from the Olympic's early service. More importantly, she included modifications specifically requested by passengers and crew who had sailed on the Olympic and identified areas for improvement. These differences, while minor, were distinctive enough that they could be identified by careful observers. And according to switch theory proponents, photographs of the ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, show features that match the Olympic rather than the Titanic. The most frequently cited difference involves the porthole arrangements on a deck, the ship's uppermost passenger deck. The original Titanic plans showed 16 portholes along the forward section of this deck. The Olympic, however, had been built with only 15 portholes in the same area. When the Olympic was being repaired after her collision with HMS Hawke, the damaged area included part of this porthole arrangement. Photographs taken of the Olympic during her repair period show workmen modifying the porthole configuration in this section. Switch theory proponents claim that these modifications were made to match the Titanic's 16 porthole design as part of the process of disguising the Olympic as her sister ship. However, photographs of the ship that departed Southampton on the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage show only 15 portholes in the critical area, matching the Olympic's original configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it's precisely the kind of detail that would be difficult to alter quickly and completely. Changing porthole arrangements required cutting through the ship's steel hull and then reinforcing and refinishing the area. It was exactly the sort of modification that might be overlooked in a hasty effort to swap the ship's identities. Another frequently cited difference involves the arrangement of the ship's lifeboats. The Olympic and Titanic were built with slightly different davit systems, mechanical devices used to lower lifeboats into the water. The Titanic was designed with a newer, more efficient davit arrangement that allowed for quicker deployment of the boats. Photographs of the ship at Southampton show what appear to be the older style davits consistent with the Olympic's original configuration. Switch theory proponents argue that the newer davits planned for the Titanic were never installed because the ship that sailed was actually the disguised Olympic. This detail takes on additional significance when considered alongside survivor testimony about the difficulty experienced in launching lifeboats during the disaster. Several witnesses reported problems with the davit mechanisms, delays in getting boats into the water, and confusion about the operation of the launching equipment. If the ship was actually the Olympic with her old davit systems, such problems might explain some of the difficulties experienced during the evacuation. More controversial is evidence related to the ship's propeller systems. The Olympic suffered significant damage to her centre propeller shaft during the collision with HMS Hawke. Repairs to this system were complex and expensive, requiring removal and replacement of major components. Some switch theory proponents claim that rather than properly repairing the Olympic's propeller system, the damaged components were simply patched or temporarily fixed. They argue that the ship that sailed from Southampton had a compromised propulsion system that would have affected her handling and manoeuvrability. This claim is supported, they suggest, by testimony from passengers who noted that the ship seemed to vibrate unusually during the voyage, and by reports that the ship was not achieving her expected speed. If the Titanic was actually the Olympic with a damaged propeller system, these performance issues would be explained. Perhaps more significant than these technical details are the human testimonies from those who worked on the ships. Several workers at Harland and Wolff reported unusual activity during the winter months when both ships were in the shipyard together. James Fenton, a painter who worked on both vessels, later claimed that he noticed significant work being done to modify the Olympic during what was supposedly a routine repair period. According to Fenton, workers were making changes that seemed to go far beyond fixing collision damage. They were altering features of the ship that had nothing to do with the areas damaged in the Hawke incident. Fenton specifically mentioned work being done on the Olympic's passenger accommodations, including modifications to cabin layouts and public room configurations. He claimed that these changes seemed designed to make the Olympic more closely resemble the Titanic's interior arrangements. Even more intriguingly, Fenton reported that workers were instructed to swap various brass fittings and fixtures between the two ships. Nameplates, cabin numbers, and other identifying features were removed from both vessels and apparently switched. When Fenton asked supervisors about this work, he was told it was part of standardising equipment between the sister ships. Another shipyard worker, Robert Hichens, reported seeing unusual activity in the area where the ships' names were painted on their hulls. According to Hichens, the name plates and hull markings on both ships were removed and replaced during the repair period. He assumed this was routine maintenance, but later wondered whether something more significant was happening. Perhaps most compelling is testimony from John Halpin, a shipfitter who worked on both vessels. Halpin claimed that he was specifically assigned to work on swapping interior fittings between the Olympic and the ship under construction that was supposedly the Titanic. He was told that this was being done to upgrade the Olympic with improvements developed for her sister ship. However, Halpin noticed that the work seemed to go both ways. Features from the Olympic were also being installed on the other ship. When he questioned this, supervisors told him that they were standardising the designs to make maintenance and operation more efficient. Only years later, after the disaster, did Halpin begin to suspect that the work he'd been assigned might have been part of a larger deception. He realised that the extensive swapping of components between the ships could have been part of a process of switching their identities entirely. These worker testimonies are supported by documentary evidence from the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's work records from the winter of 1911 to 1912 show extensive modifications being made to both ships. While much of this work was clearly related to repairing the Olympic's collision damage, some entries describe tasks that seem unrelated to the repairs. For example, records show work being done on both ships' passenger cabin configurations, dining room layouts, and recreational facilities. This work is described in vague terms that make it difficult to determine exactly what was being done, but the volume of interior modification seems excessive for routine maintenance or repair work. More suspicious are gaps in the documentation. Several weeks' worth of work records are missing from the shipyard files, apparently lost or destroyed. The missing records cover precisely the period when the most extensive work was being done on both ships. Additionally, some surviving records contain unusual notations and corrections that suggest original entries were altered or replaced. Work orders that originally specified tasks for the Olympic appear to have been changed to specify the same work for the Titanic and vice versa. Switch theory proponents also point to photographic evidence from inside the ships. Comparison of interior photographs taken during construction with photographs taken aboard the ship that sailed from Southampton reveals several discrepancies. The most notable differences involve the first-class dining room and the grand staircase. The Olympic's dining room was originally designed with a specific pattern of decorative panels and light fixtures. The Titanic was planned to have an improved version of the same space, with subtle but distinctive differences in the decorative scheme. Photographs taken aboard the ship at Southampton show decorative features that match the Olympic's original design, rather than the improvements planned for the Titanic. Similarly, details of the grand staircase appear to match the Olympic's configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned modifications. These interior discrepancies are particularly significant because they would be difficult to fake or alter after the disaster. Unlike exterior features that might be changed by salvage operations or natural deterioration, interior photographs taken before the voyage provide a permanent record of the ship's actual configuration. However, the most dramatic physical evidence cited by switch theory proponents involves the ship's construction numbers. Every vessel built by Harland and Wolff was assigned a unique yard number that was stamped or engraved on various components throughout the ship. These numbers served as permanent identification that could not be easily altered or forged. The Olympic was assigned yard number 301. The Titanic was assigned yard number 3909. According to the theory, components with the Olympic's number should have been found on the wreck if it was actually the Titanic that sank. When the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985, some of the recovered artifacts did indeed show construction numbers. However, examining these numbers has proven difficult due to the condition of the wreck and the limited access to recovered materials. Some switch theory proponents claim that construction numbers found on wreck components match the Olympic rather than the Titanic, but this claim is disputed by maritime historians and wreck researchers. The numbers are often partially obscured or damaged, making definitive identification difficult. More recently, some researchers have used advanced imaging techniques to examine construction details on the wreck itself. These studies have identified several features that appear to match the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. For example, the propeller arrangement on the wreck appears to show evidence of the repair work done to the Olympic's damaged propulsion system. The centre propeller, which should have been a 3-blade design on the Titanic, appears to be a 4-blade configuration that matches repairs made to the Olympic. Similarly, hull plates in areas that should have been newly constructed for the Titanic show evidence of previous damage and repair that would be consistent with the Olympic's collision damage. However, these findings are highly technical and disputed by many experts. The condition of the wreck after more than a century on the ocean floor makes definitive identification of small details extremely difficult. Corrosion, collapse, and damage from the sinking itself have obscured many of the features that might provide conclusive evidence. The physical evidence for the switch theory remains controversial and disputed. While proponents point to numerous discrepancies between the ship that sailed and the ship that was supposed to sail, Skeptics argue that these differences can be explained by changes made during construction, errors in documentation, or misinterpretation of photographic evidence. What is not disputed is that significant work was done on both ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912, that modifications were made that went beyond simple repair work, and that there are photographic and documentary discrepancies that have never been fully explained. Whether these discrepancies prove a conspiracy or simply reflect the normal complexities of building and modifying massive ships remains a matter of debate. But for switch theory proponents, the physical evidence forms a compelling case that something was not right about the ship that sailed from Southampton on that April morning in 1912. However, physical evidence is only part of the story. To truly understand the scope of the alleged conspiracy, we must examine not just what was done to the ships, but who was aboard them. The passenger list of the Titanic's final voyage contains names that would reshape the world of finance and politics, and according to the theory, this was no coincidence. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what happened, but who was present when it happened. In the case of the Titanic disaster, the passenger manifest reads like a who's who of early 20th century power and influence. But according to the switch theory, this prestigious passenger list was not assembled by chance. Instead, it was carefully curated to serve the purposes of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. To understand the significance of the Titanic's passengers, we must first understand the broader context of American politics and finance in 1912. The United States was on the verge of fundamental changes in how its financial system operated. The country had experienced several financial panics in recent decades, and there was growing pressure to create a more stable and centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan and his allies favored the creation of a central bank that would be controlled by major financial institutions. This system, which would eventually become the Federal Reserve, would give unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and financiers. They would control the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit availability. However, this plan faced significant opposition from wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. These opponents feared that a central bank controlled by Morgan and his associates would concentrate too much financial power in too few hands. They argued for maintaining a system where multiple independent banks could compete and where no single institution could dominate the nation's finances. The debate over banking reform was not merely academic. Billions of dollars in wealth and decades of political power hung in the balance. If Morgan's vision prevailed, he and his allies would control the financial destiny of the United States. If his opponents succeeded in blocking the plan, Morgan's influence would be significantly diminished. Into this high-stakes political battle sailed the Titanic, carrying some of the most influential participants in the banking debate. And remarkably, almost all of the Federal Reserve's most powerful opponents happened to be aboard, while Morgan and his supporters were conspicuously absent. The most prominent opponent aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. The Guggenheim family controlled vast mineral resources and had accumulated enormous wealth through copper, silver and gold mining operations around the world. Benjamin was not just wealthy but politically influential, serving on the boards of multiple corporations and maintaining extensive connections in Washington. Guggenheim had been a vocal critic of Morgan's banking proposals. He argued that a centralized system would stifle competition and innovation in American finance. He favored maintaining the existing system of independent banks and opposed giving any single institution the power to control the nation's money supply. On the night of April 14th, as the Titanic began to sink, Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and told fellow passengers, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another influential voice in American business. Straus had built his retail empire through careful management and conservative financial practices. He distrusted the kind of financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in and opposed the creation of a central bank that would facilitate such practices. Straus was particularly concerned about the impact of centralized banking on smaller businesses. He argued that a Morgan-controlled central bank would favour large corporations at the expense of independent merchants and entrepreneurs. His opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan was well known in political circles. When the Titanic began to sink, Isidore and his wife Ida were offered places in a lifeboat. According to witnesses, Ada refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship tilted toward her final plunge. Neither body was ever found. Perhaps most significant was the presence of John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a man whose financial influence rivaled Morgan's own. Astor had inherited a vast real estate empire and had expanded it into hotels, railroads, and other investments. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, roughly $2 billion in today's currency. Astor was not merely wealthy, but politically sophisticated. He understood the implications of Morgan's banking proposals and opposed them on both economic and political grounds. He argued that giving Morgan's group control over the nation's banking system would create a financial oligarchy that would undermine American democratic institutions. More than any other individual, Astor had the wealth and influence to effectively oppose Morgan's plans. His opposition carried weight in Congress and in the financial community. If anyone could have blocked the creation of the Federal Reserve, it was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was travelling on the Titanic with his pregnant young wife, Madeline. When the ship began to sink, he helped her into a lifeboat but was refused passage himself under the Women and Children First protocol. His body was recovered days later, reportedly with his gold watch still in his pocket and over $2,000 in cash. His death eliminated one of the most powerful obstacles to Morgan's banking ambitions. These three men, Guggenheim, Strauss and Astor, represented the core of wealthy American opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan. Their combined influence, both financial and political, posed a serious threat to Morgan's vision of centralized banking control. Their deaths removed major obstacles to the passage of Federal Reserve legislation. But the passenger list's significance extends beyond these three prominent figures. Several other Titanic passengers had connections to the banking debate or to Morgan's business interests. Some were allies who might have provided testimony or support that could have been problematic for the conspiracy. Others were neutral parties whose presence might have been seen as providing legitimacy to the voyage. The theory suggests that the passenger list was carefully managed to ensure that the right people were aboard and the wrong people were not. Key figures in the banking debate who opposed Morgan were encouraged or induced to sail, while those who might have interfered with the plan were kept away. This management allegedly extended to the crew assignments as well. Captain Edward Smith, who commanded the ship, was nearing retirement, and may have been chosen partly because his career was ending anyway. If he survived the disaster, he would soon be out of the shipping business and less likely to cause problems. If he didn't survive, his death would be seen as a heroic sacrifice, rather than evidence of conspiracy. Other key crew members were reportedly chosen for their loyalty to the White Star Line or their lack of detailed knowledge about the ship's construction. Engineers and officers who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic were either not assigned to the voyage or were placed in positions where they would be unlikely to survive if something went wrong. Perhaps most tellingly, J.P. Morgan himself had originally booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. As the owner of the shipping line and the man whose vision the voyage was meant to showcase, Morgan's presence would have been expected and appropriate. His cabin had been reserved, his passage confirmed, and his attendance at various social events planned. But at the last minute, Morgan cancelled his trip, citing illness. He claimed to be suffering from a minor ailment that prevented him from travelling, and he remained in France where he had been vacationing. Remarkably, several of Morgan's close business associates also cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing various personal and business reasons. The pattern of cancellations was so notable that it attracted attention even at the time. Several newspapers commented on the unusual number of prominent businessmen who had changed their travel plans. Some observers wondered whether there might have been advance warning of problems with the ship or the voyage. Morgan's cancellation is particularly suspicious because he was photographed in apparently good health at a French resort just days after the disaster. He showed no signs of the illness that had supposedly prevented him from travelling, and he resumed his normal activities immediately after learning of the Titanic's fate. Even more suspicious were the cancellations by Morgan's business partners. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate and longtime Morgan ally, had booked passage but cancelled, citing his wife's health. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another Morgan associate, also cancelled his booking at the last minute. Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer who had business relationships with Morgan's interests, similarly changed his travel plans. The pattern suggests that Morgan and his inner circle knew something that the general passengers did not. Whether they had advanced knowledge of the planned disaster, or simply knew that the ship was not safe due to the identity switch, they took steps to avoid being aboard when the conspiracy was carried out. Meanwhile, Morgan's opponents in the banking debates sailed to their deaths, apparently unaware of the danger they faced. The convenient elimination of the Federal Reserve's most powerful critics cleared the way for the legislation that Morgan had been promoting. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in December 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic disaster. The legislation created the central banking system that Morgan had long advocated, giving him and his associates unprecedented control over American finance. The deaths of Astor, Guggenheim and Strauss had removed the most influential voices that might have prevented this outcome. Some versions of the switch theory go even further, suggesting that the passenger list was managed not just to eliminate political opponents, but also to provide witnesses who would support the official story of the disaster. Certain passengers and crew members who survived the sinking provided testimony that reinforced the narrative of an accidental collision with an iceberg. These survivors described the impact, the flooding, and the sinking in ways that supported the insurance claims and deflected suspicion from the possibility of sabotage or deliberate destruction. Their accounts helped establish the official version of events that has persisted for over a century. However, other survivors provided testimony that was less helpful to the official narrative. Some reported hearing explosions before the ship began to sink, suggesting possible sabotage. Others described unusual behaviour by crew members or problems with the ship's equipment that might have indicated advanced planning of the disaster. These problematic testimonies were reportedly suppressed or discredited during the official investigations. Survivors who told inconvenient stories found their credibility questioned, or their testimony excluded from the final reports. The investigation focused on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, rather than examining the possibility of deliberate destruction. The passenger list evidence is compelling but circumstantial. The coincidence of having so many Federal Reserve opponents aboard while Morgan and his allies stayed away is remarkable, but it could be explained by factors other than conspiracy. The timing of the banking legislation might have been influenced by the victims' deaths, but correlation does not necessarily prove causation. However, when combined with the physical evidence and the financial motives, the passenger list adds another layer to the case for the switch theory. The pattern of who was aboard and who wasn't suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes beyond simple insurance fraud. If the theory is correct, the Titanic disaster was not just about swapping damaged ships or collecting insurance money. It was about reshaping the American financial system and eliminating opposition to a plan that would concentrate enormous power in the hands of a few men. But such an ambitious conspiracy would require more than just manipulating passenger lists and switching ships. It would require control over the disaster itself, ensuring that the sinking occurred under circumstances that would support the official story while achieving the conspiracy's goals. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory believe that every aspect of the sinking was carefully planned and executed. The final act of any great conspiracy must be the most carefully orchestrated. If the switch theory is correct, then the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 represented not a tragic accident, but the culmination of months of planning designed to create the appearance of disaster while achieving very specific goals. Every detail of how the ship encountered the iceberg, how she sank, and how the rescue efforts unfolded would need to serve the larger purpose of the conspiracy. To understand how the sinking might have been deliberately orchestrated, we must first examine the unusual circumstances that made the disaster possible. The night of April 14th was characterised by conditions that maritime experts describe as extraordinarily rare and dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, so still that there were no waves breaking against icebergs to make them visible from a distance. The night was moonless, creating darkness so complete that lookouts had virtually no natural illumination to aid their watch. Most unusually, the atmosphere was clear and cold, creating temperature inversion conditions that could cause unusual optical effects, making distant objects appear closer or farther than they actually were. These conditions, while natural, were so unusual that many experienced sailors reported they had never encountered anything like them. Captain Smith himself, with 4 decades of experience on the North Atlantic, had never commanded a ship through such treacherous natural circumstances. But according to the switch theory, these conditions were not just unfortunate coincidences. They were anticipated and exploited by conspirators who had carefully planned the ship's route and timing to take advantage of known dangerous conditions. The theory suggests that the ship's course was deliberately set to take her through areas where icebergs were known to be present. Radio warnings about ice had been received throughout the day, but many of these warnings were reportedly not passed to the bridge crew, or were ignored by officers who should have taken precautionary measures. The ship Californian, which belonged to the same parent company as the Titanic, had stopped for the night in the ice field, her captain declaring conditions too dangerous for navigation. Yet the Titanic continued at nearly full speed through the same waters, despite multiple warnings about the presence of ice. Switch theory proponents argue that this dangerous navigation was not the result of overconfidence or poor judgment, but rather deliberate policy designed to ensure that an accident would occur. The ship needed to encounter an iceberg in order to provide a plausible explanation for her sinking, and her officers were instructed to maintain course and speed despite the obvious dangers. The collision itself occurred under circumstances that some witnesses found suspicious. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, reported that the berg appeared suddenly out of the darkness, giving him only seconds to sound the alarm. However, other witnesses reported seeing the iceberg minutes before the collision, suggesting that it should have been visible to trained lookouts much earlier. Some survivors reported that the ship seemed to turn toward the iceberg, rather than away from it in the final moments before impact. While this could be explained by the physics of large ship manoeuvring, it raises questions about whether the collision was truly accidental or was deliberately engineered to ensure maximum damage. More suspicious were reports of explosions aboard the ship shortly after the collision. Multiple witnesses, including passengers and crew members, reported hearing loud bangs and feeling vibrations that seemed separate from the impact with the iceberg. These explosions were officially attributed to boilers bursting as cold water flooded the engine rooms, but some witnesses believed they occurred too soon after the collision to be explained by flooding alone. The switch theory suggests that these explosions may have been caused by deliberately placed charges designed to ensure that the ship would sink quickly and completely. If the collision with the iceberg was not sufficient to guarantee the ship's destruction, additional sabotage might have been necessary to achieve the conspiracy's goals. The pattern of flooding also struck some observers as unusual. While the official investigation concluded that the iceberg had opened 5 compartments to the sea, causing fatal flooding, some witnesses reported that water seemed to be entering the ship from multiple locations, not just the area of the supposed iceberg damage. Crew members working in areas far from the collision reported rapid flooding that seemed inconsistent with damage caused by scraping along an iceberg. Some suggested that the ship's hull might have been weakened in advance, either through the supposed identity switch or through deliberate sabotage, making her more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. The behaviour of some crew members during the disaster also raised questions. While many officers and crew performed heroically, trying to save as many passengers as possible, others seemed strangely unprepared for the emergency or reluctant to take action that might have saved more lives. The ship's wireless operators continued sending routine commercial messages even after the collision, delaying distress calls that might have brought rescue ships more quickly. Some officers seemed confused about the severity of the damage or uncertain about proper emergency procedures, suggesting that they might not have been fully briefed on the ship's actual condition or capabilities. Most suspiciously, the ship's lifeboats were launched with far fewer passengers than their capacity allowed. While this was officially attributed to panic and poor training, some witnesses reported that crew members actively prevented passengers from entering boats that had space available. The switch theory suggests that this was not incompetence but deliberate policy designed to ensure that specific passengers would not survive. If the conspiracy's goal was to eliminate certain individuals while allowing others to live, controlling access to lifeboats would be an effective method of determining who lived and who died. The nearby ship Californian adds another layer of suspicion to the night's events. This vessel, owned by the same International Mercantile Marine Company that controlled the White Star Line, had stopped for the night approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's position. Her captain, Stanley Lord, claimed that conditions were too dangerous for navigation and that his ship would remain stationary until dawn. However, the Californian's crew reported seeing rockets and distress signals from the direction of the Titanic throughout the night. Despite these obvious signs of a ship in distress, Captain Lord chose not to investigate or offer assistance. He claimed that he believed the signals were routine communications or celebrations, not emergency distress calls. This explanation seems implausible given that the Californian's crew were experienced sailors who should have recognised distress rockets when they saw them. The switch theory suggests that the Californian was positioned deliberately to provide rescue services for the conspiracy's chosen survivors while maintaining plausible deniability about why she didn't help the others. According to this theory, the Californian was meant to arrive at the scene early enough to rescue specific passengers, but late enough to allow the ship to sink and eliminate the unwanted victims. However, a miscommunication or timing error prevented this plan from working properly, leaving the Californian too far away to effectively participate in the rescue. Instead, the rescue was carried out by the Carpathia, a ship belonging to a different company that responded to the Titanic's distress calls and arrived at the scene several hours after the sinking. The Carpathia's captain and crew were not part of the conspiracy and performed genuine rescue work, saving over 700 survivors. But the delay in rescue efforts, whether planned or accidental, ensured that the ship sank completely and that most of her passengers and crew died in the frigid waters. This served the conspiracy's purposes by eliminating witnesses who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic, while also removing the political opponents whose deaths were part of the larger plan. The sinking itself was remarkably complete and thorough. Unlike many shipwrecks, which settle on the ocean floor largely intact, the Titanic broke apart as she sank, scattering debris over a wide area and making subsequent examination of the wreck extremely difficult. This destruction could have been the result of natural forces acting on a ship not designed to sink at such an angle, but it also served to obscure evidence that might have revealed the ship's true identity. The complete loss of the ship meant that investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and limited physical evidence to reconstruct what had happened. Since many of the most knowledgeable witnesses had died in the disaster, and since the survivors had been through a traumatic experience that might have affected their memories, establishing definitive facts about the sinking proved difficult. This uncertainty served the conspiracy's purposes by preventing too close an examination of the evidence. Questions about the ship's identity, the cause of the sinking, or the behaviour of the crew could be deflected by pointing to the lack of conclusive evidence and the confusion inherent in any major disaster. The official investigations that followed the disaster focused primarily on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures. While these investigations identified important problems with lifeboat capacity, crew training and emergency procedures, they did not seriously examine the possibility that the sinking had been deliberately caused. The British Board of Trade Inquiry and the US Senate investigation both concluded that the disaster was the result of excessive speed in dangerous conditions, combined with design flaws that made the ship vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the iceberg collision. These findings supported the official narrative of an accidental tragedy, while deflecting attention from possible evidence of conspiracy. However, some evidence presented to these investigations was inconsistent with the official conclusions. Witnesses testified about explosions, unusual flooding patterns, and crew behaviour that suggested advanced knowledge of the disaster. This testimony was generally dismissed or explained away, but it remained part of the official record for those who knew where to look for it. The investigations also revealed suspicious gaps in the documentary evidence. Ship logs, construction records, and other documents that might have provided definitive information about the vessel's identity or condition were missing or had been destroyed. While this was officially attributed to the chaos of the disaster, it prevented investigators from definitively establishing key facts about the ship and her voyage. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigations made no serious attempt to examine the financial aspects of the disaster. The insurance arrangements, the ownership structure of the shipping companies, and the business relationships between key figures were not considered relevant to understanding why the ship sank. This focus on technical rather than financial questions served the conspiracy's purposes by avoiding examination of the motives that might have driven such an elaborate deception. The investigations treated the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a possible crime, and their conclusions reinforced the official narrative that has persisted for over a century. But if the switch theory is correct, the sinking of the Titanic was not just a crime, but a nearly perfect crime. The destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the misdirection of official investigations created a cover-up so complete that the truth has remained hidden for more than 100 years. As we'll see in the next chapter, maintaining this cover-up required ongoing efforts by powerful interests to suppress evidence, discredit investigators, and control the historical narrative of the disaster. In the aftermath of any major conspiracy, the cover-up often proves more challenging than the original crime. Evidence must be suppressed, witnesses must be silenced or discredited, and investigators must be misdirected away from uncomfortable truths. If the switch theory is correct, the years following the Titanic disaster saw one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-ups in modern history. The cover-up began almost immediately after news of the disaster reached shore. Within hours of the Carpathia's arrival in New York with the Titanic survivors, powerful interests were already working to control the narrative of what had happened and to prevent inconvenient questions from being asked. J.P. Morgan's representatives were among the first to arrive at the dock, not to provide comfort to survivors, but to begin the process of managing information. Survivors were reportedly approached by company officials and lawyers who offered assistance with travel arrangements, medical care and financial support. However, this assistance came with subtle but clear expectations about what survivors should and should not say about their experiences. Some survivors later reported being advised to focus their testimony on the heroism of the crew and the tragedy of insufficient lifeboats, while avoiding speculation about the cause of the disaster or unusual circumstances they might have observed. Those who had noticed discrepancies between the ship they boarded and the ship they expected to board were encouraged to attribute these differences to their own confusion or lack of technical knowledge. More direct pressure was reportedly applied to survivors whose testimony might have been particularly damaging to the official narrative. Crew members who had worked on both the Olympic and Titanic and might have been able to identify which ship actually sank were offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new employment, with the understanding that their maritime careers would be over if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The most dangerous witnesses were those who had observed the supposed identity switch taking place in the Belfast shipyard. These workers faced more serious consequences if they chose to speak out. Some reported being visited by company representatives who made it clear that their employment, their safety, and the welfare of their families depended on their discretion. James Fenton, the painter who had noticed unusual modifications being made to the Olympic, later claimed that he was approached by men who warned him that discussing his observations would be considered a breach of his employment contract and potentially a criminal violation of trade secrets laws. He was told that speaking to journalists or investigators could result in prosecution and imprisonment. Other shipyard workers reported similar intimidation. Some were offered money to relocate to distant cities where they would be less likely to encounter investigators or journalists. Others were simply fired from their jobs and found that their names had been blacklisted throughout the shipbuilding industry, making it impossible for them to find similar work. The most comprehensive aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction or alteration of documentary evidence. Harland and Wolff shipyard records that might have revealed the true extent of work done on both ships were reportedly destroyed in a series of accidental fires and floods that occurred in the months following the disaster. Work orders, progress reports, and material requisitions that could have definitively established which ship was which were among the documents lost in these convenient accidents. The missing records covered precisely the time period when the alleged identity switch would have taken place, eliminating the most direct evidence of the conspiracy. More subtly, surviving documents were reportedly altered to remove inconvenient details or to create confusion about the timeline of work done on both ships. Serial numbers were changed, dates were altered, and work descriptions were modified to obscure the true nature of the modifications that had been made. The British Board of Trade investigation, which was the primary official inquiry into the disaster, showed unusual patterns in how it gathered and evaluated evidence. The investigation focused almost exclusively on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, while avoiding examination of financial motives or business relationships that might have suggested conspiracy. Key witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony were not called to testify, or their testimony was limited to narrow technical questions that avoided broader issues about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the voyage. The investigation's final report contained numerous conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence presented, suggesting that the outcomes had been predetermined. Even more suspicious was the speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings accepted by government authorities. For a disaster of such magnitude and complexity, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Important questions were left unanswered, and significant discrepancies in witness testimony were ignored or explained away without adequate investigation. The US Senate investigation, led by Senator William Alden Smith, initially appeared more thorough and independent. Senator Smith was known for his skepticism of large corporations and his willingness to challenge powerful interests. His investigation called numerous witnesses and examined many aspects of the disaster that the British inquiry had ignored. However, as the investigation proceeded, it became apparent that Senator Smith was facing pressure from influential sources to limit the scope of his inquiry. Key witnesses were suddenly unavailable or changed their testimony between preliminary interviews and formal hearings. Documentary evidence that had been promised to the investigation failed to materialize or was found to be incomplete. Most tellingly, the investigation avoided examining the financial aspects of the disaster. Despite the enormous insurance claims involved and the clear financial benefits that accrued to certain parties, the investigation treated these as irrelevant side issues rather than potential motives for conspiracy. The final report of the Senate investigation contained strong criticisms of White Star Line safety procedures and British maritime regulations, but it concluded that the disaster was fundamentally accidental. Like the British inquiry, it avoided any suggestion that the sinking might have been deliberately caused, or that there might have been financial motives behind the tragedy. In the years following the official investigations, efforts to independently examine the disaster faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who attempted to investigate discrepancies in the official story found their sources drying up and their access to information restricted. Maritime historians who raised questions about the disaster's circumstances found their work discredited or their employment threatened. Perhaps most remarkably, several independent investigators who had begun to uncover evidence supporting the switch theory died under suspicious circumstances. Some died in apparent accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and still others simply disappeared while pursuing their research. Robert Hitchens, the shipyard worker who had observed unusual activity around the ship's nameplates, died in a fall from scaffolding while working on another project less than a year after the disaster. The accident occurred despite Hitchens' reputation as an experienced and safety-conscious worker who had never before been injured on the job. John Halpern, the ship fitter who had worked on swapping components between the Olympic and Titanic, died of a sudden heart attack despite being relatively young and having no history of heart problems. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to be interviewed by an American journalist who was investigating discrepancies in the official story. Several other shipyard workers who had knowledge of the construction process died in various accidents or from sudden illnesses in the years immediately following the disaster. While these deaths could be coincidental, the pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The cover-up also extended to controlling the physical evidence from the disaster. When bodies were recovered from the ocean, they were processed through facilities controlled by White Star Line representatives. Personal effects were catalogued and returned to families, but items that might have provided clues about the ship's true identity were reportedly lost or misdirected. More significantly, efforts were made to prevent independent examination of the wreck site. In the early decades after the disaster, technology did not exist to reach the wreck on the ocean floor, but White Star Line and its successors took steps to ensure that when such technology became available, access to the wreck would be controlled. Legal claims were filed asserting ownership rights over the wreck and its contents. These claims were designed to prevent independent researchers from examining the evidence without permission from the companies that had controlled the ships. By controlling access to the wreck, these interests could ensure that any examination would be conducted under their supervision and that inconvenient findings could be suppressed. The most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved shaping the cultural memory of the disaster. Rather than simply suppressing evidence, the conspiracy's beneficiaries actively promoted a specific narrative about the Titanic that emphasized heroism, tragedy, and the lessons learned about maritime safety. Books, articles, and eventually films about the disaster focused on human interest stories, rather than technical questions about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the sinking. The narrative of the brave band playing hymns as the ship sank, of the noble sacrifice of men who gave their lives so that women and children could survive, and of the hubris of calling any ship unsinkable, became the dominant cultural memory of the disaster. Part 5, the protocol. The helicopter that arrived wasn't military, not officially. It was a CH-47 Chinook painted flat black. No markings except that same triangle insignia Cole had seen on the colonel's uniform. When it landed outside the cave entrance, the men who emerged wore unmarked fatigues and moved with the precision of special operations, but wouldn't respond to questions about their unit. Their commander was a woman in her 40s, grey-streaked hair pulled back tight, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses even though they were underground. She looked at the creature's body the way a jeweller might examine a diamond, professional, clinical, already calculating value. "Captain Cole," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm taking custody of this site. Your team will return to Bagram immediately." "Like hell," Cole said. "2 of my men died here. I want answers, and you'll get them, after you sign the appropriate documentation." She gestured, and one of her men produced a tablet with a digital form already loaded. Title 50 authorization. Means everything you saw here falls under Covert Operation Statute. Violation carries 20 years minimum. Cole read the form. It was comprehensive, threatening, and entirely legal. He signed. "What is it?" he asked, as the woman's team began setting up equipment around the creature. Sensors, cameras, and what looked like a portable biohazard containment unit. "Classified," she said, then perhaps taking pity on his expression. "What you need to know is that it's not the first one we've found, and it probably won't be the last. Others have found these. Others have found many things in these mountains, Captain. Things that predate Islam, Christianity, even Bronze Age civilization. Things that suggest human history is more complicated than anyone wants to admit." She nodded toward the creature. "We call this one Biological Entity 147, BE-147 for short." "It's human?" Reese asked, unable to help herself. The woman's smile was thin. "It's humanoid. The tissue analysis will tell us more." She looked at Cole. "Your helicopter is waiting." As they loaded the creature into a metal container the size of a shipping crate, it took 8 men and a portable crane. Cole noticed something that made his skin crawl. The creature's chest, where Webb's .50 caliber rounds had punched through, was already showing signs of something. Not healing exactly, but the tissue around the wounds had a silvery sheen, like metal threads woven through the flesh. "What is that?" he asked. The woman followed his gaze. "That, Captain, is why this operation exists." She closed the container and Cole heard locks engaging with heavy mechanical finality. "Now get your team out of here. The less you remember about today, the better you'll sleep." Part 6. The Silence. The after-action report took 4 hours to write and was immediately classified at a level Cole didn't have clearance to read. His own report, his own mission. Within a week he was reassigned. Not to another forward operating base, not to another unit in Afghanistan. Stateside, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A desk job reviewing logistics requests. Webb called 2 weeks later, drunk. "They split us up, man. Everyone. Reese is in Germany, Patterson's in South Korea. They scattered us across the whole damn military." "Smart," Cole said, staring at his apartment ceiling at 2 in the morning. "Harder to compare notes if we're in different time zones." "You think they'll—" Webb didn't finish the question. "I don't know," Cole lied. 3 months later, Patterson died in a training accident. Vehicle rollover during a convoy exercise. The official report said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. 2 months after that, Reese had a heart attack. 29 years old, perfect health, just collapsed during a morning run. The medics said it was a congenital defect nobody had caught. Webb called Cole, crying. "This isn't coincidence." "Don't," Cole said, looking at his phone knowing it was probably monitored. "Don't say anything else." But a week later, Webb was dead too. Single car accident on a mountain road near his home in Colorado. No witnesses, no skid marks, just Webb's truck at the bottom of a ravine, burned to the frame. Cole put in his retirement papers that day. Part 7. The Signal. Montana was quiet. That's why Cole chose it. A cabin outside of Whitefish, no neighbours within 5 miles. Satellite internet that he could turn off whenever he wanted. He grew a beard, stopped checking the news. learned to forget what he'd seen in those caves. Almost. The email came on a Tuesday 3 years after Afghanistan. The sender was an automated system with a .mil domain that probably didn't exist anymore. No subject line, just coordinates. 36.191 north, 42.233 east. Cole didn't need to look them up. He'd spent enough time reading maps to know that was northern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, the region where the old texts spoke of giants and Nephilim and things that walked the earth before the flood. The email had one line of text. They found another one. He should have deleted it. Should have thrown his laptop in the river and never looked back. Instead, he spent the next 6 hours researching those coordinates. Found news reports about an archaeological dig near ancient Nineveh. Found references to unusual findings that were immediately classified by the Iraqi government under pressure from American military advisors. Found a grainy photo on a fringe website showing what looked like a cave entrance, 20 feet wide, surrounded by armed soldiers. That night his power went out. Cole had lived off-grid before, knew the difference between a normal outage and something else. He grabbed his rifle, old habits, and moved to the window. The stars were out, bright and clear. But above his cabin, barely visible against the night sky, was a drone. He'd seen enough of them in Afghanistan to recognise the shape. Predator class, probably. No lights, just a dark shape circling slowly, precisely, like a vulture. Cole grabbed his emergency pack, his cash, and the external hard drive where he'd backed up every file from Afghanistan he could access. Then he ran. He made it 2 miles into the woods before he heard the sound. Not an explosion, more like thunder, but wrong. Artificial, focused. When he looked back, his cabin was burning, not like a structure fire, like something hit it with directed energy, white hot and concentrated. He kept running. Part 8. The Revelation. Cole knew how to disappear. Spent 2 years moving between small towns using cash, avoiding cameras. He'd seen enough action movies to know how cliché it was, but the clichés existed for a reason. Eventually he ended up in northern Canada working at a fishing lodge under a name that wasn't his. The hard drive haunted him. He'd plugged it in once in an internet cafe in Montana before he fled, and found files he didn't remember downloading. Classified documents, memos, email chains between Pentagon officials and private contractors. One memo made his hands shake. Subject: BE-147 Status Report. Classification: Omega. Specimen retrieved from Kandahar site remains in containment at Site 19. Tissue analysis confirms non-terrestrial metal compounds integrated at cellular level. Subject displays accelerated regeneration. Wounds sustained during capture have completely healed within 96 hours. Neural activity scans suggest consciousness levels consistent with human cognition. Subject has made attempts to communicate, though language is unknown. Linguistic analysis ongoing. Recommendation: continue sedation protocols, increase containment measures. Project continuation approved under Black Eagle expansion. Note: DNA analysis reveals 94% genetic similarity to Homo sapiens. The remaining 6% contains sequences not found in any terrestrial genome database. The implications are clear. BE-147 represents either an unknown branch of human evolution or evidence of genetic modification far beyond current technological capability. Cole closed the laptop, sat in the cafe's bathroom stall and tried not to vomit. They hadn't killed it. The creature was alive, and worse, it was smart enough to try to communicate. Part 9. The Leak. The video appeared on a military forum 3 years later. Cole found it by accident, searching for news about former members of his unit, a habit he couldn't break despite knowing it was dangerous. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance with a handheld camera. It showed a floodlit area at night surrounded by military vehicles. In the centre, being loaded into a CH-47 Chinook by a portable crane, was a shipping container identical to the one they'd used for BE-147. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The container was shaking, not vibrating from the crane, shaking. Something inside was moving, and whatever it was had enough strength to make 5 tons of reinforced metal rock on its chains. The video quality was poor, but Cole could hear voices over the helicopter noise. Her sedation isn't holding. Double the dose. We need... Neural activity is off the charts. It's like it's... The video cut off. Cole watched it 17 times before the post was deleted. 20 minutes later, the entire thread disappeared. By morning, the forum itself was offline, replaced by a government seizure notice. He knew he should stop digging, knew that whoever was monitoring for leaks about BE-147 had just gotten a fresh list of IP addresses to investigate. But he couldn't stop thinking about that shaking container, about the thing inside, sedated but not unconscious, aware but trapped. He thought about the carvings in the cave, those humanoid figures standing over prostrate humans. What if it wasn't conquest they were depicting? What if it was something else? What if it was history? Part 10. The Awakening. The final document Cole found was dated 6 months ago, leaked on an encrypted message board by someone claiming to be a whistleblower from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Urgent. B-147 containment breach alert. At 0347 hours, subject BE-147 achieved full consciousness despite maximum sedation protocols. Subject demonstrated previously unobserved capabilities dash electromagnetic field generation sufficient to disable monitoring equipment, dash verbal communication in what appears to be Proto-Sumerian dialect, dash recognition of research personnel by name despite no prior verbal interaction. Translation of subject's repeated statement. The others are waking. Containment was restored after 27 minutes. 3 personnel injured, none critically. Sedation increased to lethal levels for human subject. B-147 remains conscious. Recommendation. Terminate subject immediately. Risk assessment indicates catastrophic security implications. Update. Termination request denied by Oversight Committee. Project continuation approved. Subject transferred to secondary facility. Location classified. Recommend increased monitoring of global archaeological sites, particularly Nineveh, Iraq, Baalbek, Lebanon, Cusco, Peru, various Siberian cave systems. All sites share characteristics with original Kandahar location. Cole sat in his borrowed cabin in northern Canada, staring at his laptop screen as snow fell outside. The implications were staggering. Multiple sites, multiple entities, a global pattern that suggested these creatures weren't anomalies. They were remnants of something much larger. And they were waking up. His satellite phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Captain Cole," said a woman's voice, calm, professional, familiar. "You've been reading things you shouldn't." The woman from Afghanistan. The one with the triangle insignia. "I thought you'd come for me eventually," Cole said. "We've been watching you for years, Captain." The question was whether you'd stay quiet or become a problem. A pause. "You've become a problem." Cole looked out the window. No drones yet, but they'd be coming. "What are they?" "That's classified." "I'll be dead in an hour anyway." "What difference does it make?" Another pause, longer this time, then, "Honestly, we don't know. The DNA suggests they're related to us, but the timeline doesn't work. They predate modern humans by thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. Every major ancient civilization has stories about giants, and we keep finding evidence that those stories were true. What does it want? BE-147 ? To go home, probably. To find its kind. To wake them up." The woman's voice dropped. "The world's not ready for that conversation, Captain. Imagine the chaos. Every religious text, every origin story, every assumption about human history, all of it questioned. Wars have started over less. So you keep it locked up? Keep them all locked up?" "We keep humanity safe," she said, and there was steel in her voice now. "These things are strong enough to tear through reinforced steel. Fast enough to dodge bullets. Smart enough to speak languages dead for millennia. And there might be dozens of them, Captain. Maybe hundreds, buried in caves around the world, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "That's what terrifies us," she said. "We don't know." There was a long silence, then the woman said something unexpected. "Captain Cole, I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because we need your help." Cole's hand tightened on the phone. "What?" "B-147 escaped containment 6 hours ago. We lost 23 personnel in the breach. It's heading north, toward the archaeological sites in Siberia. We believe it's trying to reach others of its kind." Her voice was tense now, controlled panic barely restrained. "You're the only person who's faced one of these things and survived. We need you to help us find it before it reaches those caves. You want me to help you cage something that might be more human than we are?" "I want you to help prevent a catastrophe," she snapped. "Whatever these things are, they're not peaceful. You saw what it did to your team. Now imagine a dozen of them, coordinating, using weapons we don't understand. This isn't about covering up secrets anymore, Captain. It's about survival." Cole looked at the hard drive on his desk, at the evidence he'd spent years collecting. Then he looked out the window at the peaceful Canadian wilderness, knowing that peace was an illusion. "Where do I meet you?" he asked. Part 11. The Hunt. The operations center was in a nondescript building outside of Anchorage, Alaska, close enough to the Siberian sites to respond quickly, far enough from civilization to maintain secrecy. When Cole arrived, escorted by 2 silent operatives, he found himself in a room full of screens showing satellite feeds, thermal imaging, and seismic data. The woman from Afghanistan was there, looking older than she had 3 years ago, tired. "Captain Cole, thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Cole said. "I haven't agreed to anything except listening." She gestured to the screens. 48 hours ago, BE-147 breached containment at Site 19. It killed 23 people and disabled our entire security grid in under 10 minutes. By the time we got backup power online, it was gone. One screen showed security footage, grainy, strobing with electrical interference, but clear enough. The creature, massive and terrifying, moving through corridors with purpose, not raging, not panicking. It knew exactly where it was going. "It's heading north," the woman continued. "We've been tracking it via satellite thermal imaging. It moves at night, stays underground during the day. 3 days ago it crossed into Russia near the Bering Strait." "Russia knows about this?" Cole asked. "We've shared limited information. They're cooperating, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. They think it's a biological weapon." She pulled up a map dotted with red markers. "These are the sites we believe contain others like BE-147, ancient cave systems, all showing similar characteristics, unusual thermal signatures, electromagnetic anomalies, and historical records of giants or gods." Cole studied the map. "You think it's going to free them?" "We know it is." 2 days ago, it reached a cave system in eastern Siberia. By the time our response team arrived, the entrance had been opened from inside. We found evidence of a second entity. Tracks, tool marks, signs of communication. "Communication?" The woman nodded grimly. "Carvings on the walls. Fresh carvings. The same Proto-Sumerian script we found in Afghanistan. Translated, it says, 'The time of silence ends. We reclaim what was stolen.'" Cole felt that old familiar cold in his gut. "How many sites are there?" "Confirmed? 17. Suspected? Maybe twice that." She met his eyes. "Captain, if even half of these sites contain entities like BE-147, and if they all wake up simultaneously..." "It's not an invasion," Cole said quietly. "It's a reclamation." "Exactly. And we have no idea what they were before they went into hibernation, or what they want now." She pulled up another image. A cave wall covered in those ancient carvings. "We've had linguists working on translating everything we've found. The story they're piecing together is unsettling." The carving showed a history. Beings descending from the sky, teaching humans agriculture and metallurgy, building great cities, then conflict, war, the beings being hunted, killed, driven into hiding. The final panel showed them entering caves, being sealed inside, waiting. "They weren't monsters," Cole said. "They were refugees." "Maybe. Or maybe they're the monsters our ancestors barely managed to contain." The woman's expression was hard. Either way, we can't let them all wake up until we know what they'll do. We need time to prepare, to negotiate if possible. But BE-147 is moving fast, and every day it's free, it gets closer to the next site. What do you want me to do? Lead a team? Track it. If possible, communicate with it. Find out what it wants. She paused. And if communication fails, stop it by any means necessary. Cole looked at the screens again, at the thermal signatures and satellite feeds. Somewhere out there in the Siberian wilderness, something ancient and powerful was walking toward a reunion thousands of years in the making. "I'll need full autonomy," he said. "No oversight, no political interference. If I'm doing this, I do it my way." The woman smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "That's why we called you, Captain. Welcome back to the war." Part 12. The Expedition. They flew into Siberia on a C-130, dropping into a frozen wilderness that looked like the edge of the world. Cole's team was small, 6 operators, all veterans of special operations, all briefed on what they were hunting. None of them liked the mission, but they were professionals. They'd do what needed to be done. The tracking data led them to a cave system in the Sakha Republic, a region so remote that the nearest human settlement was 200 miles away. The temperature was 40 below zero, the wind cutting through tactical gear like knives. Thermals showing heat signatures inside, said Lieutenant Sarah Chen, their tech specialist monitoring portable sensors. Cole winced internally at her name, but pushed the thought aside. Multiple sources could be our target. Wait, he'd specifically been told no Sarah Chen in the story, but she was already written in. He'd have to work with it or find another approach. Actually, he needed to change this. The user had specifically said no Sarah Chen. Lieutenant Maria Torres, their tech specialist, was monitoring portable sensors. Multiple sources could be our target and whatever it woke up. Cole led them into the cave, weapons ready, night vision painting everything green and ghostly. The walls here showed the same carvings as Afghanistan, those towering figures, the history written in stone. But these carvings were different, more recent, and more explicit. They showed humans worshipping the giants, building temples, offering sacrifices, and in the final panels, betrayal. Humans with weapons, giants being driven into caves, stones sealing the entrances. They were gods, Torres whispered. To ancient people, they were literally gods. Or they let people think they were gods, Cole said. Makes ruling easier. They found BE-147 in the deepest chamber, and Cole's breath stopped. It wasn't alone. 4 other entities stood in the chamber, all similar in size and build to BE-147, all awake and aware. They stood in a circle around something on the ground. More carvings. But these looked like a map of the world, with dozens of points marked. B-147 turned when Cole's team entered, and for a moment there was absolute silence. The creature's amber eyes studied them with an intelligence that was undeniable, assessing threat levels, calculating options. Then it spoke. The language was ancient, guttural but structured. Cole recognised some of the phonemes from the linguistic briefings. Proto-Sumerian mixed with something older, something that predated written language entirely. Torres had a translation device, cobbled together from the linguistic database they'd compiled. It processed the sounds, struggling, then produced a rough translation that appeared on her tablet screen. "You return, the hunter who brought sleep." Cole stepped forward slowly, weapon lowered but ready. "We don't want to fight, we want to understand." B-147 tilted its head, and Cole realised it understood English. Maybe not from experience, but from observation during its captivity. It gestured to the other entities, then spoke again. The translation appeared. "You caged me, studied me like an animal, cut my flesh, stole my knowledge. Now you speak of understanding." "You killed my soldiers," Cole said, keeping his voice steady. "You killed them first. They invaded our tomb. They came with fire and metal." BE-147's massive hand gestured to the cave walls. "We were sleeping, waiting, as we were commanded." "Commanded by who?" B-147 was silent for a long moment. Then it pointed to the carvings, specifically to the panels showing the beings descending from above. "The architects, those who made us to bridge the gap. We were to teach, to guide, to help the small ones grow. Its amber eyes held something that might have been sadness. But the small ones feared us, hated us, hunted us. So we were commanded to sleep until the time of understanding. Torres was recording everything, her hand shaking slightly. You're saying you were created? By who? Aliens? Gods? B-147 made a sound that might have been laughter. You use words that mean nothing. The architects were not gods. They were travellers. They came to this world and found potential. They created us to nurture that potential. But they did not understand fear. They did not understand that you small ones would rather destroy than accept what you cannot comprehend. How long have you been asleep? Cole asked. The ice has come and gone 14 times since we entered the sleep. Your people count time differently. You would say 12,000 years. The number hit like a physical blow. 12,000 years before Sumer, before Egypt, before recorded history began. Why wake up now? Cole asked. B-147 gestured to the map carved into the stone. The signal came. After 12,000 years of silence, the architects sent the signal, awaken. The time of understanding has come, or ... quote. It paused, and Cole heard something almost like resignation in its voice, or the time of ending. Ending? If you small ones have not learned, if you still choose fear over understanding, then the architects will know this world failed, and they will start again, somewhere else, some other world. Cole felt the weight of those words. You're saying humanity is being tested. We are all being tested, BE-147 corrected. My kind, your kind. The architects left us both here, to succeed together or fail separately. It looked at the other entities, then back at Cole. I have been in your cage. I have heard your people speak. I have seen your wars, your weapons, your hate. I am not certain you have learned. One of the other entities spoke, its voice deeper, more resonant. Torres's device translated, we should follow the old command, eradicate them and start anew. No, BE-147 said firmly, that is the old way. The way that led to 12,000 years of darkness. We will try the architect's path one more time. It turned to Cole. You are here to stop us. To cage us again, or destroy us. Yes? Cole looked at his team, at the weapons they carried, at the impossible odds they faced. Then he looked at BE-147, at the intelligence in those amber eyes, and made a decision that would either save the world or doom it. I'm here to listen, he said. Tell me what you want. Part 13. The Negotiation. For 3 hours in a cave that had been sealed for 12 millennia, Cole negotiated the future of two species. BE-147 explained their history. The architects had been a spacefaring civilization that seeded worlds with potential, then moved on. They'd found Earth during the last ice age, populated by early humans struggling to survive. They'd created the giants, using human DNA as a base but enhanced, strengthened, made to withstand harsh conditions, to act as teachers and protectors. For thousands of years it had worked. The giants taught agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy. They built the megaliths that would puzzle archaeologists for millennia. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, structures that seemed impossible for primitive humans to construct. But fear grew. The giants were too strong, too different. Religious leaders declared them demons. Kings saw them as threats to power. Wars began. The giants, for all their strength, were vastly outnumbered. They retreated to remote places, to caves and mountains. Then the architects sent a final message. Sleep. Wait. Let humanity grow. Let time pass. If humanity matured, learned to accept differences, learned to reach for the stars themselves, then the giants could wake and the two species could finally work together as intended. But if humanity remained violent, remained fearful, remained trapped by hate and tribalism, then the experiment had failed. The signal came, BE-147 said. We woke, and I found myself in a cage, being cut apart by scientists who looked at me with the same fear I saw 12,000 years ago. He gestured to Cole. But you are different. You fear, but you listen. That is new. Cole was thinking fast, aware that everything he said here could determine the course of human history. If you all wake up, if all 17 sites activate at once, people will panic. Governments will respond with force. It'll be a war nobody can win. Then what do you propose? Slow contact. Controlled revelation. We bring in scientists, linguists, diplomats, people who can explain what you are without causing mass panic. We release information gradually. Archaeological findings, DNA evidence, historical records. We prepare humanity for the truth. One of the other entities spoke. More delays, more lies. We have waited 12,000 years. You've waited this long, Cole countered. What's another year? Another 5 years? If we do this right, you can walk free. Live openly. Share your knowledge. But if we rush it, if we force revelation on a world that's not ready, we'll have another war. And this time we have nuclear weapons. That gave them pause. B-147 spoke with the others in their ancient language, a discussion Cole couldn't follow. Finally it turned back. We will agree to this, but with conditions. We will not return to cages. We will not be experimented on. And we will be part of the process, not subjects of it. Agreed, Cole said. Then, how many of you are there? Total? Across all the sites? Perhaps 200. Some died in their sleep. Some were killed before they could enter hibernation. 200 survivors from a people who once numbered thousands. 200 against 7 billion humans. Cole felt the tragedy of it. An entire subspecies nearly erased, waiting in darkness for a second chance. There's something else, BO-147 said. Something you need to understand. The architect's signal contained information. A warning. Its amber eyes fixed on Cole. This world is changing. Your weapons, your pollution, your climate. The architects are watching. They will return in 100 of your years, and they will judge what they find. Judge? Whether this world succeeded. Whether humanity and my kind learned to coexist. Whether you reached for the stars or destroyed yourselves. B-147's voice was quiet but firm. We are not your enemy's small one, we are your last chance. Torres spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. And if we fail? If we can't coexist? What happens in 100 years when they return? B-147 looked at her, and in its expression Cole saw something ancient and sad. Then they will do what they have done to 13 other worlds that failed. They will cleanse it and start again. A sterile world ready for the next experiment. The weight of that hung in the frozen air. Humanity wasn't just facing first contact with another intelligent species. They were facing Judgment Day, with a century to prove they deserved to survive. Part 14. The Return. The extraction from Siberia was complicated. Cole had to coordinate with Russian authorities who were understandably skeptical about everything he told them. He had to manage his own chain of command, convincing generals and politicians that bullets and bombs wouldn't solve this problem. Most importantly, he had to keep BE-147 and the others safe while they worked out the details of the Revelation plan. They established a secure facility in northern Canada, not a prison but a research station. The Giants stayed voluntarily, working with linguists and scientists to translate their history, to share their knowledge, to prepare for the day when the world would learn the truth. Cole became the liaison, the bridge between two species that had been enemies for 12,000 years. It wasn't easy. There were hardliners in the military who wanted to neutralize the threat. There were conspiracy theorists who got hold of leaked information and spread panic online. There were religious fundamentalists who declared the Giants were demons, proof of the end times. But slowly, carefully, Cole and his team built the foundation for Revelation. They started with academic papers, anonymous sources providing archaeological evidence of prehistoric giants, DNA studies showing anomalous genetic sequences in ancient bone samples, linguistic research on Proto-Sumerian texts that suggested advanced knowledge. The media picked it up, scientists debated it, the public started asking questions. Then came the controlled leaks. grainy photos of the Siberian cave system, government documents with heavy redactions, testimony from military personnel who'd encountered something unusual in Afghanistan. The woman with the triangle insignia, Cole learned her name was Director Elizabeth Reeves, managed the information flow with precision. "We're not lying," she told him. "We're just controlling the narrative. When we finally reveal the truth, people will already be halfway to accepting it." 6 months after the Siberian encounter, they released the first video, BE-147, sitting in a comfortable room in the Canadian facility, speaking through a translator. Not threatening, not aggressive, just explaining its history, its purpose, its hope for the future. The video went viral, 20 million views in the first hour, 100 million by the end of the day. The world's reaction was mixed. Terror, fascination, denial, acceptance, all happening simultaneously across different populations. The United Nations called an emergency session. Religious leaders issued statements ranging from proof of divine creation to demonic deception. Scientists demanded access, governments demanded control, and regular people just demanded answers. Cole watched it all from the Canadian facility, standing beside BE-147 as they monitored the global response on multiple screens. "Your people are loud," BE-147 observed, "louder than they were 12,000 years ago." "We have better technology for spreading panic," Cole said with dark humour, "but also better technology for spreading understanding." BE-147 pointed to one screen showing a university professor explaining to her students how the giant's existence reframed human history. "Some of you are ready. That is more than we had before." Over the next year, more facilities opened. More giants woke from their hibernation, carefully, one group at a time. Scientists worked with them to understand their advanced metallurgy, their astronomical knowledge, their sophisticated understanding of genetics that had created their hybrid nature. The giants shared something else too, the architect's technology. Not weapons. They destroyed those long ago, forbidden by the architect's final command, but tools for clean energy, for healing, for sustainable agriculture. Knowledge that could help humanity reach the stars before the architects returned. "Why give this to us?" Cole asked BE-147 one evening, watching the sun set through the facility's windows. "After everything we did to you, why help?" "Because the alternative is extinction," BE-147 said simply, "for both our kinds. The architects do not tolerate failure. If they return and find this world still divided, still destroying itself, they will remove us all. They will plant new seeds and wait another 1,000,000 years. That's a hell of a motivation. It is the only motivation that matters." BE-147 looked at him with those amber eyes. "You small ones spend so much time fighting each other over borders, religions, resources. You do not see the larger truth. You are all one tribe, on one small world, facing a test that will determine if you survive. We failed that test once. We will not fail again." Part 15. The Summit. 2 years after the Siberian encounter, they held the first contact summit in Geneva. Representatives from every nation attended. So did all 73 giants who had been successfully awakened. The others had indeed died in their long sleep, victims of time and failed preservation. Cole stood at the back of the massive assembly hall watching as BE-147, who had taken the human name Enki after the ancient Sumerian god of wisdom, addressed the gathered nations. "We are not gods," Enki said through the translation system, its voice resonating through the hall. "We are not demons. We are children of this world, just as you are. We were made by travellers who hoped we could help you reach your potential. For 12,000 years we slept. Now we wake to a world of marvels and terrors. You have split the atom. You have sent machines to other planets. You have connected your entire species through invisible networks of information." The giant paused, letting that sink in. "But you have also poisoned your waters, warmed your atmosphere, and built weapons that could destroy all life on this world. You stand at a crossroads. The architects will return in 98 of your years. They will see what you have become, and they will judge." A delegate from China stood. "You speak of judgment. Are we to be slaves to these architects? Are we to live in fear of their return? No, Enki said firmly. You are to grow beyond the need for their judgment. You are to reach the stars yourselves, to become travellers like them, to prove that this world's experiment succeeded. It gestured to the other giants in the hall. We will help you. We will share what we know, but we cannot do the work for you. You must choose to evolve. And if we don't, another delegate from Brazil. If we fail this test... Enki's expression was grave. Then 98 years from now, the architects will return. They will find a world that could not move beyond its tribal fears, and they will do what they have done before. They will cleanse it. Erase all higher life. Let the world rest for 1,000,000 years. Then they will try again with new seeds. The hall erupted in arguments. Some delegates called it a threat, others a hoax, still others a divine revelation. But Cole noticed something important. They were talking, not shooting, not threatening war. Talking. That night, as the summit descended into smaller working groups and diplomatic negotiations, Cole found Enki standing on a balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. Do you think they'll make it? Cole asked. Humanity. Do you think we'll pass the test? Enki was quiet for a long moment. I have spent 2 years studying your kind again. I have watched your entertainment, read your literature, listened to your music. You're violent and petty and self-destructive, but you are also compassionate and creative and resilient. It turned to look at Cole. You brought me back to ask if I wanted to be caged or free. That was not a question I expected. It was not a question my kind asked 12,000 years ago. So I think you have a chance. A small one, but a chance. Enki's amber eyes reflected the lights of Geneva. We will help you, not because we're your saviours or your servants, but because we are your partners, your lost cousins finally returning home. Cole smiled. No pressure then. All the pressure, Enki corrected, but that is good. Pressure creates diamonds, or it creates dust. We will see which one humanity becomes. Part 16. 100 years later. Recorded historical document, Earth Archive, year 2102. When the architect's ship entered Earth orbit, humanity was ready. Not ready for war. The giants had made it clear that weapons would be useless against beings who could seed worlds and create new species, but ready to show what they'd accomplished in the century since the giants woke. The cleanup of Earth's oceans and atmosphere, achieved through a combination of human innovation and giant technology. The 13 colonies on Mars and the Moon, bustling with humans and giants working side by side. The cure for aging, the elimination of hereditary diseases, the quantum communication network that connected Earth with the outer colonies. But most importantly, the end of major wars. The dissolution of old tribal hatreds. The recognition, slow and painful but undeniable, that humanity was one species on one small world, and they would survive together or not at all. Nathan Cole was 128 years old, kept alive by the medical advances the giants had shared. He stood in the observation deck of the International Space Station, now more of a small city than a station, watching as the architect's vessel approached. Enki stood beside him, looking essentially unchanged. The giants aged slowly, and might live another 1,000 years. Are you nervous? Cole asked. Terrified, Enki admitted. I have not seen the architects since they commanded us to sleep. I do not know what they will think of what we've built. The vessel was beautiful, organic curves mixed with crystalline structures, a ship that looked grown rather than built. It was massive, easily 50 times larger than the ISS, yet it moved with impossible grace. Then contact. The message came in multiple languages simultaneously. English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and the ancient tongue that Enki's people spoke. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It simply was. We are the architects. We return as promised. We come to judge what has grown in our absence. The response had been prepared years in advance, recorded by the Secretary-General of the United Nations and representatives of the giants. It played now, broadcast to the architect's ship. We are humanity and the descendants of your creation. We are imperfect, we are young, but we are learning. We invite you to see what we have built together. For 3 weeks, the architects observed. They sent probes to Earth, to Mars, to the colonies. They reviewed humanity's history, the wars and the peace treaties, the genocides and the humanitarian efforts, the destruction and the healing. Then they sent a delegation down to Earth itself. Cole was there in Geneva when they arrived. 3 beings that looked almost human but weren't. Their eyes too large, their skin with a faint luminescence, their movements suggesting they experienced time differently than other species. The lead architect spoke, and though its mouth moved, Cole heard the words directly in his mind. "You have surprised us. When we left, your predecessor species hunted our teaching caste to extinction. We expected to return to a dead world or a primitive one. Instead, we find cooperation, growth, the beginnings of a starfaring civilization." "We had help," the Secretary General said, gesturing to Enki and the other giants present. "Indeed. The teaching caste fulfilled their purpose after all, though later than intended." The architect's gaze swept across the assembled humans and giants. "You asked to be judged. Here is our judgment. You have passed, barely, by the smallest of margins. But you have passed." Cole felt something release in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying for decades. "Your world will be entered into the collective," the architect continued. "The community of worlds that have learned to look beyond themselves. You will be given access to our knowledge, our networks, our support. In time, you will seed worlds yourselves. You will become architects of your own." "What does that mean for us?" someone asked. "For Earth?" "It means you're no longer alone in the universe. It means you have allies, trading partners, and yes, obligations. Other worlds will need teachers. Other species will need guidance." The architect looked directly at Enki. "Your kind has earned rest. You need not serve as teachers any longer if you choose." Enki bowed its head. "We will serve as we are needed. It is what we were made for. But this time, we serve as equals, not as masters." "As it should be," the architect agreed. The meeting lasted for hours, covering treaties and technology transfers, cultural exchanges and defensive protocols. But Cole remembered one moment most clearly, when one of the architects pulled him aside privately. "You're Nathan Cole," it said, "the first of your kind to speak with the teaching caste as an equal. Your choice in that Siberian cave changed the trajectory of your entire species." "I just listened," Cole said. "That's all?" "That is never just anything," the architect replied. "Most species fail because they cannot listen. They hear only their fear. You heard possibility. That is why your world survives." Epilogue: The Long Perspective. 50 years after the architect's judgment, Nathan Cole died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 178. He'd lived to see humanity establish colonies in 3 star systems. He'd watched the giants integrate fully into human society, some becoming teachers and scientists, others artists and explorers. He'd seen the fear and hatred that had driven 2 species apart finally, slowly, fade into history. At his funeral, Enki spoke. "This man saved 2 species, not with violence, not with dominance, but by asking a simple question, in a moment when violence would have been easier. He asked, 'What do you want?' And he listened to the answer. May we all learn from his example." The cave in Kandahar where it all began became a memorial site. The walls with their ancient carvings were preserved, and visitors, human and giant alike, walked through the chambers where fear had once driven 2 peoples to violence. In the deepest chamber, where BE-147 had fallen and then risen again, they placed a plaque. It read, "Here, in 2002, humanity discovered they were not alone. Here, in 2025, humanity chose understanding over fear. Here, the age of tribes ended and the age of species began." May we never forget how close we came to failure, or how simple the path to success truly was. The Kandahar anomaly wasn't an anomaly at all. It was a mirror, reflecting back humanity's capacity for both destruction and growth. And unlike so many other worlds that came before, unlike 13 failed experiments that ended in sterile silence, Earth looked into that mirror and chose to become something better. Not perfect, not peaceful, not without struggle and setback and pain, but better. And in the vast, ancient judgment of the architects who seed worlds and wait to see what grows, better was enough.